before Monkey D. Luffy declared that he would become the Pirate King, before Roger actually became the Pirate King, way before Dory and Brogy started their duel, infinitely earlier than when Emmet attacked the Holy Land of Marijois, prior to the birth of the oldest known giant, dwarfing the age of the Void Century, and even predating the calendar system as we know it. Before all of the things it is that I just said, the One Piece world lived in an era known as the Age of Heaven. This was a period characterized by deities living in a single nation known as the Land of Gods, the most well-known denizen of which being the Sun God. However, these gods gradually disappeared from the world, transitioning into the Age of the Sea Circle, an era dominated by humanity. But even though we can't see them, the influence of these gods still exists within the world today, and some of the gods themselves may even still be lurking on this planet. This is the story of the Age of Heaven, a time period which, quite frankly, we know frighteningly little about. And I know what you're gonna say, internet man, if we know so little, then why does this video still have ever so long to go? Well, look, it'd be a lot shorter if you just stopped asking questions. Many One Piece fans, even those who have been reading for decades, are often shocked to find out that One Piece world history actually follows a surprisingly strict and detailed calendar. In fact, it's so specific and detailed that I can give you the exact years and even days of many key events. For example, the raid on Onigashima took place on March 17th in the year 1524, almost exactly 2 years after Ace's duel with Blackbeard on Banara Island, which occurred on the 22nd of March in the year 1522, which was about 2 weeks after Luffy defeated Enel on Skypiea on March 10th, which itself was a mere 6 days after Luffy defeated Crocodile and ended the Alabasta Civil War on March 4th, which in and of itself was exactly 1 month after Luffy set sail from Fuchsia Village to become the Pirate King and started the journey that has consumed and enhanced many of our real-world lives. That is where the story of One Piece begins, but it's not where the world begins, not even close. And every now and then, what Eiichiro Oda does is he drops something. Clumsy Oda, he drops these tiny pieces of information to reveal just how colossal the scope of this world truly is. One key incident being chapter 228, when Nami read Nolan's logbook and gave us the exact date. Nami said that the entry was dated as the Age of Cayenne, 1120, June 21st, which Nami then says was 400 years ago, meaning that this moment on Jaya, and in fact all of pre-time skip One Piece, took place in the year 1520, except that is wrong, and Nami was using 400 years ago as an approximation. And we only truly discovered what year it was when Nolan's flashback began, which the narrator both said was 400 years ago and took place in 1122, meaning that pre-time skip One Piece took place in the year 1522. And this is the nexus point that we can use to discover and approximate the date of any event, past or present. Not present. It should be pretty obvious when the present's taking place. I think I meant past and future. I'm confusing myself now. I'm gonna move on. Because we do run into a very intriguing problem when we reach the year 0 in the past. Because we know that recorded history has existed in the One Piece world for at least 4,000 years, because that was when the Palace of Alabana was built, which is a bit tricky because the skilled mathematicians among you may have realized that 4,000 is a much more bigger number than 1,500, meaning that we've got a lot of history unaccounted for by the Age of Cayenne. And that's because everything prior to that time period is covered by the Tenreki, which means sky calendar and is also referred to as the Age of Heaven, which is a time period first mentioned by Nico Robin during Alabasta. And the small pieces of actually recorded knowledge that we have from this era come from Robin as well. She recites the history of Alabasta during the Age of Heaven, with brief events such as Kahira conquering Alabasta in the Year of Heaven 239, or the completion of the Great Taf Temple in Erumalu in the year 306, and she also mentions a hero named Mamudin who existed in the year 325. However, all of this information is currently of questionable reliability, because when reciting this, Robin, well, she was improvising. She was pretending that the Alabasta poneglyph contained nothing but ancient history, and certainly not the location of the ancient weapon Pluton, no. So we could certainly disregard these names and details, however, I do think it's highly likely that what Robin is saying is accurate. She spent 4 years working with Crocodile to target Alabasta and cause their civil war, and in that time, I imagine that the very history-hungry Nico Robin would have devoured every last fact about Alabasta, and that cultural knowledge could have greatly assisted Baroque works in understanding how to use Alabasta's history and customs against its own people. TLDR, we don't know if anything she was saying was true, but it probably is. And here, what Robin was doing was pulling from her factual knowledge to make her lie about Pluton sound more convincing. However, while the exact details about Alabasta's history are questionable, the existence of the Age of Heaven is not. Alright, so let's make sense of this. Before talking about Heaven, the Age of Cayenne is pretty criminally undertranslated in the official English. I know that a lot of people prefer names to stay in Japanese Japanese, myself included, for most of the time. For example, I definitely prefer not to call Inuarashi Dogstorm, just doesn't sound as good to me. However, the Age of Cayenne is a case where this word needed to be translated as literally as it could be and shoved straight into your internet watching faces, because it gives away such a massive part of One Piece history. Firstly, it's not just Cayenne. The full term is Cayenne Reki, literally meaning the Sea Circle calendar. This is the calendar system that we currently follow, and thus One Piece takes place in the Age of the Sea Circle. And if you haven't figured it out already, here's the reason why we needed to hear this as literally as possible. Because the key geographical feature of the One Piece planet as we know it is the Red Line, a continent that circumnavigates the globe and forms a massive circle, which is juxtaposed by the literal sea circle that is the Grand Line, a stretch of water that also circumnavigates the planet. And so the implication here is that prior to the Age of the Sea Circle, the Grand Line did not exist, at least not as we know it. And whatever was created or naturally formed is when the Sea Circle calendar began at year 0, as well as the year that the Age of Heaven officially ended, which is very, very similar to how the Japanese creation myth plays out in Shinto chronology, which is a lot like a very stylistic Big Bang theory. It claims that all matter at the beginning of the universe was compressed into the shape of an egg that began to move and separate into 2 distinct planes. The lightest particles within the egg reached the top of the universe, and they combined together to form the first clouds known as the Takamagahara, literally meaning the high plane of heaven. Meanwhile, the other particles that were too dense to rise sunk to the lower part of the universe and formed the plane of existence that we, mere mortals, attempt to enjoy to this very day. And after this happened, Shinto claims that we entered a period known as the Age of Gods, which I believe is the inspiration for Oda's Age of Heaven. And the topic of gods in One Piece is one that's brought up far more frequently than you may realize, and a lot of modern struggles in this world can be boiled down to a clash of gods or a clash of humans who claim to be gods. And so here is the hypothesis. During the Age of Heaven, these gods actually existed in some capacity, or at least figures who were impactful enough to earn the title of god even if they weren't literal gods. This of course includes the sun god Nika, which the Sky People, Lunarians, Buccaneers, and Giants all at the very least have their own form of, but also the forest, rain, and earth gods who have been historically worshipped and mentioned in One Piece as well. Among others, many others. The term god comes up in One Piece far too commonly to list every example in this video. But as the legend goes, these gods may have lived in a single society at the top of the Red Line, because Whitebeard once said that the Red Line was known as Kami no Kuni, meaning land of gods. And furthermore, Queen also stated that the Lunarians who once occupied that realm were once recognized as gods themselves. Quite specifically, Queen said, that guy, being king, is a remnant of the extinct Lunarians, a monster capable of surviving in any natural environment. In the distant past, his people were known as gods. And then Sanji took a bit of a mid-battle break to ask a very poignant question, which is that, well, if those Lunarians are so good at surviving, then why are they all dead? To which Queen snapped back that Sanji should go ask a history book, and I love the language here. He didn't tell Sanji to read a history book, he said to ask a book, which in the One Piece world is technically possible. Objects can be imbued with human-type devil fruits and become capable of communicating with us, or you could even use Big Mom's soul powers to turn the book into a living, breathing homie. So perhaps at some point in the future, we will quite literally ask a book. And I'm also wondering if we may currently have such an opportunity on Elbaf. We have access to what has to be the world's oldest library, overseen by Biblo, a devil fruit-using owl whose age has been lost to time, and he could be from the Age of Heaven for all we know. So could Zunesha, the Thriller Bark monsters, the Sea Kings, and any of these supremely old and colossal beings that look like they belong in an ancient legend. But back to the Red Line, the idea of the Lunarians themselves could be based on Yatagarasu, a crow who served as the divine messenger of the sun goddess, and it's a being that appears in some of Japan's earliest writings and often serves as a symbol of the sun itself. It's also sometimes said to have fire-related powers, like the Lunarians. And while King, the only surviving Lunarian that we know of, has never mentioned Nika or the sun god directly, his purpose in life was to wait for Joy Boy to reappear, which is directly related to the legacy of the sun god. And fun fact, King's ancestral home on the Red Line is even marked by Eiichiro Oda in one of his earliest drawings of the One Piece world. This is a map that was made in 1999, and this was done because Oda needed to set this world in stone before the crew entered the Grand Line. He needed to know where they were going. And it contains a lot of curiously labeled locations that have either been changed or not explored yet, one of which is named King's House, which is very close to where Marijois is on the top of the Red Line, and I'd like to think that this is just Oda pointing out where King used to live. That's his house right there. It's almost certainly not. I just find the idea of identifying a small home on this giant world map quite adorable. But what I'll also say for the red line is that it's very much in keeping with the Shinto creation myth. The gods rose to the top and formed their civilization, whilst the mortals sank to the lowest plane to form theirs. And this is an idea that appears in giant mythology as well, because our introduction to Elbaf was having the crew abducted by Road, who inserted them into a diorama that he called the Land of Gods, populated by mortal humans with comparatively massive Elbathian animals that were each given the title of god, including the allegedly delicious rabbit named the Ear God. And of course, Road himself took on the role of the Sun God. Although I should note that there is a slight difference in how these concepts are referred to, even though they sound pretty much exactly the same in English. The home of the Lunarian race is the Kami no Kuni, meaning Land of Gods, whereas Road's diorama was called the Kamigami no Kuni, which means essentially the same thing, but Kamigami refers to a more clear plurality of gods. And on top of this, we also have the domain of gods, the Kamigami no Chi, which is where the world nobles reside at Marjois, which is of course the ancestral home of the Lunarians. But all of these names are references to the way this land was during the Age of Heaven. And there is a very popular theory that the world government or the 20 kingdoms created the Red Line, and that the One Piece will only be found when the Red Line is destroyed, thus uniting every sea on the planet into a literal One Piece. But it's looking more like the Red Line was created by the gods during the Age of Heaven, not the world government. And it's more likely that the 20 kingdoms created the Grand Line, aka the Sea Circle. And this marked the transition of power from the gods to the false gods that we now know as the world nobles. And this again is quite similar to the transition between the Age of Gods and the Age of Humanity in Shinto chronology. The point at which the Age of Gods becomes the Age of Humanity is with the ascension of Japan's first emperor Jimmu, said to descend from both the sun goddess and the storm god. And the similarities between Jimmu and Imu, I mean, firstly you can hear it in the name, Imu sounds a lot like Jimmu, but the actual meaning of Jimmu's name can be two things. It can either mean divine might or god warrior. The second of which I find particularly intriguing because that is the title given to each of the 5 Elder Stars who serve Imu. They're all defined as the warrior gods of their respective fields. And it's even spelled with the exact same kanji, just reversed. When written in this order, the kanji reads as Jimmu, and when you flip them around, they read as Bunshin, literally meaning god of the military arts. But also, much like Leloucia, there's no evidence to suggest that Jimmu actually existed in real life, and he is considered a legend, very much like how Imu's existence is a secret lurking legend of the One Piece world. Although I should say that a character named Jimmu does appear in One Piece, but he's a filler character from a TV special, and his name is not derived from the first legendary Japanese emperor, because Jimmu also happens to be the Japanese way of saying the plain old boring English name Jim. So if there are any Jims watching right now, I'm sorry, but your parents just sort of gave up when it came to naming you. And Jim was also murdered, which is a bit wow for One Piece. Sometimes filler goes pretty hard. But there is a potential Imu-Jimmu connection being formed here, implying that Imu is the figure who triggered the transition between the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle, which, given Imu's tendency to cause rising sea levels, is definitely not out of the question. However, there is one problem that we need to address, which is that as far as we're aware, the timeline doesn't match up. The Void Century occurred from the year 600 to the year 700 of the Sea Circle calendar. So unless Imu predates even that period, it was not his ascent, or at least not the formation of the world government, that marked the transition between the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle. But there is another option, and this is a big elephant in the room, not literally like Zunesha, who can't fit in any rooms, but it's impossible to talk about this time period without mentioning the Great Kingdom, which was the primary power that existed prior to the alliance of the 20 kingdoms. And the other option is that the transition out of the Age of Heaven was marked by the rise of the Great Kingdom and whoever their leader or founder was, which, if I were to guess, whoever that person happened to be could also have been in possession of the sun god Devil Fruit that would go on to be inherited by Joy Boy and eventually Luffy. Because the gods themselves may have vanished in our current age, but their powers and influence have not. We've talked to death on this channel about Luffy and the Nika Fruit, but many of the other mentioned gods also have Devil Fruit counterparts. For example, the Forest God manifests itself pretty damn powerfully in Green Bull's Devil Fruit. The Rain God is very much present in Dragon's Storm powers, and there's no shortage of earth manipulating fruits that could account for a hidden or even fractured Earth God, which is one hypothesis for the shift between the eras. The gods disappeared, they went over there. But what they did right was they left their powers in the form of fictional fruit for humanity to use to prosper. And the first person to inherit the Sun God's abilities was whoever founded the Great Kingdom, the Jimmu of this story. And just as a quick thing here, do you remember that fancy Sun Crow Yatagarasu? Well, he was the being that guided Jimmu to the place where his nation would be established, which would give us the link between our Joy Boy / Sun God and the Lunarian people. And in lieu of Nika himself, the Lunarians are consistently waiting waiting for the next mortal being to have inherited Nika's powers. Plus, Jima was both a descendant of the sun and storm gods, which definitely suits the idea of the Will of D a lot better. A clan waiting for a person to awaken the sun god fruit, as well as the power to always cause a storm in the world with their actions. And you can also see some potential modern day hints at this idea with Luffy and Dragon. Luffy's father appears to be the closest thing we have to a storm god in the series with his wild weather powers. Although that may not necessarily be true, because Imu himself quite clearly resembles an Umibozu, a figure often depicted of pure darkness with two prominent eyes that lurks in the oceans. And from here on out, just bear in mind that this is a hypothesis. I will not apply the labels of good and evil at all because we understand too little about all of this to begin with. And what I'm about to tell you is so preposterous that you may even burst into laughter. However, you have the right to know. Imu could be the last remaining actual god from the Age of Heaven. A stubborn, bitter Umibozu who once clashed with Nika in the old world, and after the transition to the Age of the Sea Circle, made it his mission to destroy the legacy of Nika, which included Joy Boy, the Great Kingdom, the land of the gods, which he usurped and transformed into his own kingdom of Marijois, which was a process that took him about 600 years to achieve, but one that still has yet to be fully completed because he still hasn't wiped out the entirety of the Will of D, and specifically Monkey D. Luffy. And so when we see absolutely wild stuff like black magic spell circles, that might not be a devil fruit. This could be the power of an actual god, one of the oldest beings on the One Piece planet. Or alternatively, perhaps Imu is also a proxy. Like Joy Boy and Luffy with the sun god powers, Imu inherited the ability of Nika's enemy during the Age of Heaven. So there's a lot of options and a ton of stuff in this video that's going to turn out to be incorrect, but at the moment, this is the very best that we can do to speculate on the events and the legacy of the Age of Heaven. The Void Century, also known as the 100-Year Void or the Blank Century, depending on which translation it is you read or watch, is a period that spanned from approximately the years 6 to 700 of the Sea Circle calendar, with all records from this time period having been erased by a global conspiracy to obscure the true history of the world. And while this effort was shockingly successful, remnants of the Void Century do remain in the form of ancient indestructible mystery cubes, as well as paintings in certain isolated societies, and even beings that were born during the Void Century who are still alive to this very day. This is the story of the Void Century. And this story can be, rather cryptically, summed up by a singular picture, which would be the recently discovered mural on Elbaf, said to have been a children's drawing created somewhere between 800 to 900 years ago, aka the Void Century, which happens to depict the story of a man with sun god powers and this man's allies joining forces to combat an overwhelming enemy holding the sun hostage. And this man with the sun god powers is almost certainly Joy Boy, a man who Dr. Vegapunk claims was born 900 years ago right at the beginning of the Void Century, and the most prominent figure who we know of that lived during this time, and who is depicted in this Elbafian mural facing off against the Shadow Threat, alongside at least one of his crew members being the Iron Giant Emmet. And crew is a very important word to use when describing the assorted allies of Joy Boy, because Joy Boy is credited as being the first pirate in history, and therefore I suppose the first captain with the first crew. And that crew includes not only Emmet but also Zunesha, and it's even suspected that Nefertari Vivi's ancestor, Nefertari D. Lily, may have been a member of Joy Boy's crew, which is a little bit awkward, because Lily was something of an obsession for Saint Imu Nerona, who still has a painting of her hanging in his castle to this very day, 800 years later, and this obsession may have been a key part of Imu's motivations during the Void Century and everything he's instituted in the following millennia, setting up an eventual conflict with our modern-day Joy Boy, Monkey D. Luffy, as Joy Boy was the ancient user of Luffy's devil fruit, the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, and it's further theorized that Joy Boy and his crew were responsible for creating Binks' Sake, a song that has been passed down through the veins of piracy ever since the days of the Void Century, and it's also one of the very few things that has survived the purge of the Void Century. Although another key surviving piece of this history is the Noah, an arc that you can see depicted in the Elbaf mural, and it served as part of a promise between Joy Boy and the ancient mermaid princess of Fishman Island. Joy Boy promised that he would take all of the fishmen to live up to the surface world aboard the Noah. However, this promise was never fulfilled, and Joy Boy felt like really bad about this, and even made the Void Century equivalent of an apology video by carving his regret into one of 30 poneglyphs, which serve as the primary source of much of our insight into the Void Century. For example, one poneglyph mentions that during this period, the world was dominated by a single entity, much like how it is in the current day with the world government. However, during this period, that entity was known as the Great Kingdom, and their exact name is currently unknown to us as readers. Much like everything else during this period, an impossible effort was put into erasing it from all recorded history. However, the name does still exist in at least one record, a poneglyph which was deciphered by Professor Cloudy Clover, meaning that this name was likely revealed on the O'Hara poneglyph, and if so, it's even possible that Nico Robin already knows the name of the Great Kingdom. But look, the Great Kingdom, it is generally viewed quite favorably by fans of One Piece, because they were the ones fighting against the antagonistic 20 kingdoms that would go on to become our modern day enemies and tyrannical overlords of the world government. However, they may have had a genuine reason to be afraid of the Great Kingdom. It was referred to by Vegapunk as an impossibly advanced civilization, because this massive historical powerhouse was responsible for developing the ancient weapons Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, which to this very day are lingering threats of unparalleled destruction that could bring an end to the world in the wrong pair of hands. So Great Kingdom apologists would make the argument that these were never intended to be weapons, and they were instead supposed to be tools for the betterment of the world, and perhaps that is true. Perhaps they were powers designed to say bring down the red line and unite the planet, restoring it to its natural form prior to the end of the First World, as detailed in the Harley text on our buff. But we don't know that, and the existence of these ancient weapons also gave the Great Kingdom infinitely more unchecked power than they already had. So I can see why that would make the assorted lesser kingdoms a bit nervous, to say the least. However, something that was even more concerning than the ancient weapons was the power source of the Great Kingdom, a substance known as the Mother Flame, which Dr. Vegapunk has successfully replicated and resurrected to some degree in the modern day. His replica is still incomplete, but it's designed to be an undying flame that can provide infinite power to whatever needs it. And something that needs it is at least one of those ancient weapons, Uranus, which even when powered by Vegapunk's incomplete copy of the Mother Flame, is capable of destroying entire islands in a single blast. In fact, it's even scarier than that, because this is what we saw from Uranus in the modern day, powered by this teeny tiny fragment of an incomplete Mother Flame. So we can't even comprehend what this substance was truly capable of in its most complete form. Very dangerous in the wrong hands, and the Great Kingdom were also the ones who made the Iron Giant Emmet. And it's also possible that the Great Kingdom created the Devil Fruits, as the earliest recorded Devil Fruit users in the series to date are Joy Boy and Amatsuki Toki, both of whom were associated with the Great Kingdom. And that would also explain why they're called Devil Fruits, because anyone related to the Great Kingdom and the Will of D have subsequently been labeled as devils and demons. Furthermore, the existence of Devil Fruits are said to have greatly angered the sea god, resulting in a curse that takes away a Devil Fruit user's ability to swim. And from what we've read of the rather cryptic Harley text, the sea god is very much an antagonist in the history of this world, and it is currently suspected that this sea god in question is either Saint Imu Nerona, or that Imu is an inheritor of the sea god's abilities, in the same way that Joy Boy and now Luffy inherited the sun god abilities. Speaking of Imu, this man, he was alive at the time, and he was a monarch of a series of kingdoms that decided to form an alliance against the Great Kingdom. All in all, 20 kingdoms pulled their resources together to create an entity capable of standing up to the Great Kingdom, which included the Nerona family, as well as many others whose descendants we've seen in the modern day, such as the Don Quixotes, the Nefertaris, the Topmans, the Shepherds, the Ethan Barons, the Marcuses, the Jay Garcias, the Man Mayors, and the Scarlet Monarchs themselves, the Figolins. It's quite an astonishing effort, really. And what's even more incredible is that each of these 20 kingdoms put their own royalty to one side, and they each pledged allegiance to a concept known as the Empty Throne, a symbolic object designed to maintain peace within all allied nations, with the promise of equity and that there would never be a singular leader of the world, with a sword from each kingdom being placed in front of the throne as a sign of allegiance. Part of this was likely done to prevent the idea of another singular Great Kingdom style threat from ever arising, democracy good and all that, but this was all a rather clever ruse, as one man would park his silhouetted buttocks on this throne, being the aforementioned Saint Imu Nerona. It's currently unknown how he was able to secure his hidden rulership, but he was able to subdue at least 5 of the 20 founding families, representatives of which would go on to become his 5 elder stars, the sort of puppet rulers of this alliance in Imu's stead. And with this alliance now established, war was inevitable, a war that lasted the vast majority, if not even the entirety of the 100 years of the Void Century. And we still don't actually know which side instigated this war. It would be very tempting to say that it was the 20 Kingdom Alliance due to the fairly evil vibes we get from Imu and his associates, but to date, One Piece has gone to great lengths not to assign blame to either faction. And after his research into the Void Century, Dr. Vegapunk described it as a clash of two competing ideologies. He also says that the 20 Kingdoms may have actually had no choice but to go down this path due to, quote, Joy Boy's faction, whatever that means. So despite what's happening with the descendants of both of these groups in the modern day, we are still far from capable of being able to assign blame for the events of the Void Century. However, the Great Kingdom wasn't completely on its own in this conflict, and it also had a litany of powerful allies. According to the mural on Elbaf, they included the Minks of Zo, the Samurai of Wano, the Giants of Elbaf, the Tontada of Greenbit, the Lunarians, and the Fishmen all joined forces to stand against the 20 Kingdoms. And those are just the confirmed groups depicted in the mural. It's also suspected that the Buccaneers were part of this alliance, as well as the Ancient Giants, in addition to the ancient shipwrights of Water 7. In fact, we know that the ancient weapon Pluton was built on Water 7 by these ancient shipwrights, and that just in case the barriers of Wano are ever breached and the world government obtains Pluton, the plans for the original Pluton were passed down through the generations of shipwrights until they eventually ended up in the hands of Frankie, who decided to destroy them after putting his faith in Luffy and the Straw Hats. Plus, another allied faction that isn't necessarily depicted in the mural would be the Sky People of Shandora. As the Golden City Shandora was invaded by the 20 Kingdoms and did ultimately fall, a memorial was even constructed for the city itself by the heirs of Shandora, which Robin deciphered, stating that the city was defeated 800 years ago, right at the very end of the Void Century. However, Shandora was not completely destroyed, and the remnants of the Shandians would continue to protect its ruins and, most importantly, its poneglyph for the next 800 years. And Shandora was, unfortunately, only one example of a victim of the Void Century. As the Great Kingdom itself was ultimately defeated, it has now vanished from history, and everyone associated with them were either hunted down to the point of genocide or they had to retreat into isolation. Part of this was forced isolation, as the greatest physical outcome of the Void Century was that during this 100 years, global sea levels rose by an astonishing 200 meters, thus sinking the vast majority of what was the known world, leaving only small patches of land high enough to avoid it, which have now become the millions of islands scattered throughout the One Piece planet. You could spend your life sailing to each and every island on this planet, and you would have still missed 99% of everything that the world once had to offer, because the true planet is currently submerged into deep and dark waters, just waiting for the day when it will be graced by the sunlight once more. Of course, this also means that the fishmen were now 200 extra meters away from achieving their dreams of living under the sun on the surface, and whilst actively isolating themselves from the surface, they would still retain and maintain the Noah in hopes that the long-standing dream of their society would one day come true. And one Great Kingdom ally also made the rather unconventional choice to sink their own island following their defeat, which would be Wano. The ancient samurai erected walls around Wano, and thanks to centuries and centuries of rainfall, Wano became a big old bucket, completely covering its ancient civilization. However, there was method to this madness. The reason why they did this is because Wano was chosen as the location to hide and store the ancient weapon Pluton. In fact, Pluton is still there to this very day, waiting below Wano, being protected by the walls and the water. Elsewhere in the aftermath of the Great War, Joy Boy ally Zunesha was sentenced for having committed a grave crime during the Void Century, with the punishment of endless walking throughout the New World for all eternity, which has also resulted in the isolation of the Mink Society, the Mokomo Dukedom, due to Zunesha having become a phantom island. Now, the most curious thing about this is that we don't know which faction Zunesha committed a crime against. Again, it's always tempting to think that it was those evil, bad 20 Kingdom dudes. But Zunesha may have also served as something of a Judas to Joy Boy's faction, because a rather unique part of his punishment is that Zunesha can be commanded by anybody who possesses the voice of all things, which is an ability thus far only displayed by members of the D-Clan and their close allies. Joy Boy, Goldie Roger, and Monkey D. Luffy all have it, as did Kozuki Oden and Kozuki Momonosuke in the modern day. So that would be a curious caveat for the 20 Kingdoms to add to the sentence if they were the ones who punished Zunesha. But not every civilization was lucky enough to survive and isolate, as two Joy Boy affiliates, being the Buccaneers and the Lunarians, were hunted to practical extinction, with only one confirmed member of each race still being alive in the modern day: Bartholomew Kuma of the Buccaneers and King, aka Arba, of the Lunarians. But whether it be by genocide or by isolation, no one could now halt the newfound authority of the 20 Kingdoms, nor would there be anyone able to rise up for close to a millennia from this point point. And so the 20 kingdoms then evolved and together formed the world government, an alliance that would be joined by hundreds of other kingdoms over the next few centuries. However, only the original founding members received the honor of becoming world nobles. And at this point, the world government, I would say they got a little bit arrogant after defeating Joy Boy and the Great Kingdom, and they began to consider themselves to be quite literal gods. So the royalty of the 20 founding families were invited to live all the way at the top of the Red Line in the Holy Land of Marijois, where they would receive their god status. And of those 20 kingdoms, only one royal line refused the offer, which were the Nefertaris of Alabasta. But this began a sweeping new age of dynasties on the surface, as previous monarchs up and abandoned their former kingdoms to become world nobles. So for example, the Don Quixote family left their kingdom of Dressrosa, which was then inherited by the Riku dynasty. But each nation's military were then absorbed into a mega organization known as the Marines. And 800 years ago is also when the Cypherpole groups were founded, with one cell, CP0, dedicated to protecting and serving the world nobles, and another, CP9, being tapped for the purpose of protecting Enies Lobby, one that they succeeded in for 800 years before the invasion of the Straw Hats in the year 1522. And of course, CP9's role also expanded over the years to include away missions to do with intelligence and assassination, and various other Cypherpole cells were established for similar purposes. But as for Joy Boy himself, his exact fate remains obscured at the time of this recording. However, one of his final acts was to leave a treasure on a certain island, which we now call Laugh Tale, and this treasure is now known as the titular One Piece. A treasure that every faction in this world is now fighting to obtain, as it is hypothesized that whatever Joy Boy left would give the right person at the right time the ability to decide the fate of the world. But despite being 800 to 900 years ago, we actually have at least 4 survivors of the Void Century who have made their way to the modern day. One is, of course, the ever-mentioned Ema Narona, another is Zunesha, engaged in his eternity of punishment, but a third very important figure is the Iron Giant Emmet. He spent the next few centuries powered down, although he did wake up once 200 years ago due to unknown reasons and made his way to Marijois to cause assorted havoc, but he was eventually shut down again, and his hulking mechanicalness then found its way to Egghead Island, where Emmet would be awoken by the Gear 5th heartbeat of Luffy and proceeded to assist the Straw Hats in their escape of Egghead Island by unleashing the stored Haki of Joy Boy that he was given. At this point, Emmet's life status is unknown. He may very well be gone for good now, or not. He's a robot. We could just power him up again, provided he hasn't been destroyed, which he may have been. But we also have the case of Amatsuki Toki, who was born about 70 years into the Void Century and used the abilities of the Toki Toki no Mi to travel to the year 1494, where she met and married Kozuki Oden, going on to have 2 children with him and sending one of those children into the future, and eventually dying, but with her last words leaving a prophecy for the future. Like the moon, you are ignorant of the dawn. If there is one ardent wish that must be fulfilled, it will be when 9 shadows are cast, woven together through 20 years of moonlit nights. Only then shall you understand the radiance of dawn, which is thought to refer to the vassals of Odin coming together to defeat Kaido and free Wano. However, in retrospect, it is probably referring to an event that has yet to occur. Or it could serve as a double meaning, both. It could be both. But the most important lingering existences of the Void Century were the 30 cubular stones known as poneglyphs that were scattered throughout the world and together contain the true history of the Void Century. And were it not for these 30 stones, then the world government would have gotten exactly what they wanted and successfully erased 100 years of history from the world. Within the One Piece, there is a very special word, that word being incident. If something is described as an incident, that means that this is an event that has actively changed history on a global scale. We've seen many of these incidents play out right in front of our eyes, like the Enies Lobby and Impel Down incidents, and we've also been tantalizingly told of many that have happened off-screen, such as the Rocky Port incident or the Payback War. However, there is no incident more crucial to the world that we experience today than the one that occurred 38 years ago in West Blue, known as the God Valley Incident. A gigantic battle royale featuring the Roger Pirates, the Rocks Pirates, the Marines, and the Holy Knights that would change the world forever. This is the story of the God Valley Incident. Now, to set the table for this delicious meal, we need to talk about the world government, because most incidents tend to begin with an act of dickery from them. In this case, 38 years ago, the world government were holding the native hunting competition, which was an eagerly anticipated event on the World Noble calendar that occurred every 3 years. I feel like the name is fairly self-explanatory, self-explanatory, but what happens is that the world nobles select an island that is unaffiliated with the world government, proceed to surround it with marine battleships, and over the course of 3 weeks mercilessly slaughter every last citizen, all the while earning points for those killed, and this competition results in a single champion who is awarded a series of incredibly rare prizes. Winning also brings great pride to the family of the champion, because the world nobles are the descendants of 19 ancient families who came together to form the world government and construct a society of quote-unquote gods on top of the Red Line. And these family names are a huge source of pride for each individual world noble. So having the champion of the native hunting competition belong to your family is like your country winning the Olympics, and it gives every member of that family bragging rights, the most important of all of the rights for the next 3 years. And the premise of the competition is quite similar to The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, which involves a human hunt on an isolated island facilitated by a Russian aristocrat. It's commonly said that this is what inspired Eiichiro Oda to create this competition for One Piece. I don't know how much I really buy into that though. There's no actual source for this. It's more of a, hey, this thing is kinda like this thing. And I do think that the wealthy hunting the poor has been an unfortunately common idea across human history. But on this occasion, God Valley, a relatively minor island in West Blue, was chosen as the location for the native hunting competition, primarily due to the sheer audacity of this island to name itself after God. Remember, the world nobles see themselves as gods, so this is heresy to them. But God Valley also possessed an abundance of natural resources to be stripped following the competition, and it has been speculated by Emporio Ivankov that the competition was concocted as an excuse to eliminate a native population from delicious resources that the world government wishes to claim. But I think that Emporio Ivankov gives the world nobles far too much credit. From what we know of them, I would say that the slaughter and assertion of superiority as gods is their main driving force, and the existence of resources to be acquired is a secondary concern. I also shouldn't undersell the logistics of this competition. It is a massive undertaking that involves temporarily migrating the majority of world nobles from the Holy Land to the Chosen Island, because this competition isn't just for the hunters participating, it's also a big event for spectators and adjacent events that have an interest in it. For example, I imagine there's a whole gambling industry centered around betting on who the champion is going to be and how many points they're going to win by, etc. And to really emphasize what an important event this is in the World Noble calendar, in attendance for this native hunting competition on God Valley was one of the 5 Elder Stars, Saint J. Garcia Saturn. And this is a big deal because the 5 Elder Stars almost never leave the Holy Land. 1, out of disgust for the need to breathe the common surface air of the masses, but 2, because it makes the 5 Elders uncharacteristically vulnerable, which we will see as this event unfolds. But the other major world government faction we need to highlight is the presence of the Holy Knights. This is an elite squad of the most powerful individuals within the world nobles. They're quite unusual and they don't dress in the standard deep-sea diving / astronaut gear, implying that they may have given up certain privileges of the world noble lifestyle in order to serve. However, in exchange for whatever that is, they have been granted elevated power, as Holy Knights have authority over all world noble issues and can even execute world nobles. Putting that into their twisted perspective, this means that the Holy Knights have the authority to execute what they believe to be literal gods. And 38 years ago in God Valley, the Holy Knights were led by a young Figaland Garling, suspected relative of Figaland Shanks, who was also in attendance at God Valley, but we'll get into him in a bit. For now, potential relative Garling was the clear favorite to win the competition, and even started with a handicap of minus 10,000 points after he killed the King of God Valley before the contest had even begun. So speaking of points, the population of God Valley was approximately 100,000 civilians who were labeled as rabbits for the purposes of the competition. In fact, they were specifically defined as native rabbits, which is important because these citizens were treated as the most common and worth the least amount of points in the contest. In addition to that, the world government also shipped in a stock of rare and unique slaves and criminals to serve as their special rabbits, and during the God Valley incident, there were reportedly 150 rare rabbits, the killing of which earned a very vague excellence bonus. And in addition to that, there were 13 super rare rabbits which were worth 10,000 points each, one of which was a child Bartholomew Kuma, who was labeled as a super rare rabbit as he was the last known surviving member of the Buccaneer race. So not only is his existence by definition rare, but the Buccaneers are notoriously superhuman when it comes to strength and durability. So even though he was a child, only the best of hunters would be able to bring him down and claim that prize. He was like the world government's equivalent of a loot goblin. In addition to this, every rabbit also had a target painted on their back, so the competition isn't just about killing, it's about the proficiency of a hunter to cleanly hunt. And to get a bit bleak here, if you found yourself as a rabbit in one of these competitions, your chances of survival are, checks notes, 0. Prior to God Valley, not a single person had ever survived one of these competitions, and it's pretty morbid bothered to think on past contests where the world government essentially spent 3 weeks piling up the bodies of 100,000 plus people. But that was about to change because the world government made 2 major mistakes in this competition that would lead to an incident of historic proportions. One of which were the prizes on offer, and we'll get to those in a bit, but the second of which was bringing their own rare rabbits. One of which was future Revolutionary Army Commander Emporio Ivankov, but another was a young girl named Ginny who had a very particular set of skills in the world of snail communications, who had been both intercepting and globally transmitting top secret information. And it would be no exaggeration to say that this tiny girl is the single most responsible for everything that happens next. When you think of the God Valley incident from here on out, Ginny is the face of this event. Because one of the locations that picked up Ginny's transmissions was Hachinosu in the New World, which in the modern day is ruled over by Emperor of the Sea Blackbeard. However, 38 years ago, this island was in the possession of Roxty Zebek, a man whose ambition was to destroy the world government and become king of the world, and who was also powerful as well as charismatic enough to form the most legendary pirate crew to have ever existed. The Rox pirates consisted of Edward Newgate, aka Whitebeard, Golden Lion Shiki, Kaido, Amazon Lily Empress Gloriosa, the original Buckingham Stussy, the legendary Captain John, and Charlotte Lin, among so many others. There's a lot of unnamed members who we've seen, and also some named members who we haven't seen, like Silver Axe and Ochoku. But the Rox pirates took an interest in the native hunting competition because just prior to this, Hachinosu had been the target of a world government raid, which managed to steal a particularly valuable treasure from the Rox pirates, and this treasure was being offered as one of the prizes for winning the hunting contest. Now, it's never been 100% confirmed exactly what this treasure was, at least not at the time of this recording, but it's heavily implied to be the Ua no Mi Modoseryu, which Ginny describes as one of the most powerful devil fruits in all existence, allowing its user to transform into a mythical dragon. And the Rox pirates' treasure was very likely this, but there are other options. Because this devil fruit was one of only 6 prizes on offer for the contest, which were housed in the 6 individual treasure chests in a central podium location, with one of the other prizes being Niku Niku no Mi, the Paw Paw fruit, which, whilst not as coveted as the legendary dragon fruit, was still noted as being absurdly powerful in its own right. But there were 4 other chests present on God Valley that we still don't know the contents of at the time of this recording, although it's highly likely that one of them went on to contain a baby. But what we do know for a fact is that the treasure of Hachinosu was among them, and as soon as they heard Ginny's transmission, the full force of the Rox pirates were mobilized and they set sail to God Valley to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And if you're a more casual One Piece fan, then the name Roxty Zebek, you might not be too familiar with it. He doesn't get mentioned a lot in this world, and the reason for that is because this order would serve as his final act, because no one could anticipate the sheer scale of anarchy to come. Because the Rox pirates were not the only crew to hear this transmission, as it was also picked up by the Roger pirates led by future Pirate King Goldie Roger. However, this event took place long before that crown came into vision. The God Valley incident occurred approximately 13 years before the Roger pirates landed at Laugh Tale, so this was a completely different era of Roger's life. Roger immediately set sail as well and brought his full force at the time, including right-hand man Silver's Rayleigh and commonly speculated third in command Scopper Gaban. And while it's unknown exactly how many Roger pirates were part of the crew at this time, we do at the very least spot Sunbell, Yui, Millepine, and Spencer, although my assumption is that they were all there. The only exceptions would be Crocus because he gets recruited a lot later, as does Kozuki Oden, and Douglas Bullet isn't canon, so his presence is unlikely to be anywhere, let alone here. But Roger's motivation for becoming involved in this incident was very unlikely to be the treasure itself, but more so as an opportunity to confront Roxty Zebek, as after landing at God Valley, Roger rushed in and cryptically stated, "It's been a whole year. Any idea how I felt all this time?" Implying that his last confrontation with Rox was a year ago, and also potentially hinting that Roger may have lost their previous encounter. From what we see of Roger on God Valley, he comes off as quite annoyed to say the least and really itching to redeem himself, which wouldn't be too surprising as Rox has been cited as Roger's greatest historical rival, which is a pretty big statement considering that his other rivals were Whitebeard and Garp the Hero. And speaking of him, the second guy, at the time of Ginny's transmission being sent, Garp the Hero was on a lovely vacation when he got a sudden order from then Fleet Admiral Kong to head to God Valley ASAP. But the funny thing about this is that Garp was initially going to ignore the order. He was informed that the Rox pirates were heading there to get involved, but he kind of brushed that off. But what did ultimately convince Garp to to actually, carry out his duty were reports that Roger was heading to God Valley. And so do you see how this incident is an increasingly large series of knock-on effects? The world government stole a treasure from Rox, which prompted him to get involved, and knowing where Rox was prompted Roger to get involved, and Roger's presence there got Garp involved. But I'd also be remiss not to mention that Garp's most trusted associate Bogard was also summoned and by Garp's side during the incident, adding to his most legendary of legacies. But at this stage, what you have is easily the top 10, maybe even the top 15, or even the top 20 strongest individuals in the world, all heading for the same location at the same time to fight battle one another for their own individual agendas. And the truly stunning thing to think about is that this was more or less Ginny's plan the entire time. She couldn't have predicted just how well it would work, but the idea was to create enough chaos on God Valley for Ivankov, Kuma, and herself, as well as many slaves as possible to escape. And so each subsequent faction arrived on God Valley at roughly the same time. And so the God Valley incident became a battle between the Roger Pirates, the Marine forces led by Garp, the Holy Knights led by Figgle and Garling, and the Rox Pirates led by Rox, who I mentioned last because going into this conflict, the Rox Pirates were definitely the single most powerful faction. The Rox Pirates are the one group that to this day has come the closest to overthrowing the world government. And as a result of their presence, some uneasy alliances were formed. Firstly, Garp fought to protect the lives of the world nobles on God Valley, and even though that's technically his job as a Marine, the fact that he did it shows the desperation of the situation, as he was essentially aligning himself with the Holy Knights, the world nobles, and everything he despises about the world government. But more surprisingly, Roger aligned himself with Garp and the world government as well, actively protecting the world nobles and turning this incident into the Roger Pirates, the Marines, and the Holy Knights against the Rox Pirates, which honestly wasn't even the biggest issue that the Rox Pirates faced. Even with all of those odds stacked against them, they could have come out of this, but their biggest issue was that they were completely incapable of working together. Immediately after landing, they split up in order to claim the treasure for themselves, leaving the crew much more vulnerable than it otherwise should have been. And one of the ensuing conflicts that came from this is suspected to have been Figgle and Garling fighting and defeating Whitebeard, as it's highly likely that Whitebeard was referring to Garling when speaking to Shanks about a certain man who makes his scar ache. But then again, that's just speculation at this point. But what we do know is that the Rox Pirates got absolutely routed in this incident. Meanwhile, Ginny, Ivankov, and Kuma were carrying out their plan nigh on flawlessly, as the kids managed to get a hold of 2 of the prized devil fruits, with Kuma consuming the pawpaw fruit and Ivankov coming within a bee's dick of eating the dragon devil fruit before he was stopped by Big Mom, who absconded with the fruit, which again was likely the treasure of Hachinosu that they were there to claim the whole time. So this was a big win for the Rox Pirates for 5 minutes. And using his newfound devil fruit powers, Bartholomew Kuma was essentially able to teleport himself, Ginny, and Ivankov off the island and left before the God Valley incident became truly dire, as this island was then engulfed by the primary clash of Roger and Garp teaming up to face off against Rox Diesebek himself. According to the legends, neither Garp nor Roger was enough to bring down this man. And so there's a very solid argument to be made that Rox Diesebek is the single most powerful person in the One Piece lore. But Roger and Garp together were able to defeat him, which they thought would bring an end to the God Valley incident. However, the world government subsequently erased the entire island, either through a Buster Call or potentially through the ancient weapon Uranus. But either way, almost 4 decades on, if you ask someone if they've heard of God Valley, the answer will be no, because they either never learned about it, or because the ones that did know about its existence know better than to say that publicly. But this event significantly changed the direction of the planet. After Rox was defeated and assumedly killed, this put an end to his campaign to become king of the world, which may very well have succeeded if not for this incident. The remaining Rox Pirates members immediately split up, with Big Mom giving Kaido the Dragon Devil Fruit, and with 3 of the former Rox members going on to form the majority of the 4 Emperors of the Sea, an institution that is still extremely relevant to this very day, even if these 3 original Emperors no longer occupy those positions. On the side of the Marines, this is the event that earned Garp the title Hero of the Marines, and he was even offered a promotion to the position of Admiral. However, he refused, knowing that it would only put him under direct control of the world nobles. Meanwhile, the Roger Pirates would escape God Valley, having won the day and quite successfully plundering the treasure on the island, and upon examining their winnings, they opened a chest and were shocked to discover a baby Shanks, and they would go on to raise Shanks, who would be with them right up until the dissolution of the Roger Pirates. Shanks is suspected to have been either the son or a child relative of Figgle and Garling, who was placed in a chest to keep him safe and who was accidentally plundered by the Roger Pirates. And as for young Bartholomew Kuma, it turns out that he saved 500 people that day, but still felt guilty that he wasn't able to save the other 99,500 others who lost their lives. However, after this incident, the native hunting competition appears to have been discontinued, assumedly because it puts the world nobles in too much danger. So I'd call that a pretty big win for the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people who were indirectly saved by 3 children. But God Valley itself isn't a story that will ever be told in the One Piece world. The world government have done everything possible not only to erase the island itself, but also any historical records of the island, and the narrator of the series has simply stated that this event, which is one of the most influential to have ever happened in the history of this world, would be lost to the dark shadows of history. 27 years ago, professional scallywag Gol D. Roger was rudely interrupted on one of his many voyages by one Golden Lion Shiki, commander of the largest pirate fleet on the planet, and Shiki then gave Roger an ultimatum: join me or die. And Roger chose neither, as what ensued was one of the most incredible events in One Piece history that saw the collapse of an empire, the rise of a king, and the birth of a legacy that is still waiting to be fulfilled to this very day. This is the story of the Battle of Ed War, which is one of the most influential events in fictional pirate history that you'd never even know about if it wasn't for extended media, because it occurs in Chapter 0 of One Piece, which is an absolute nightmare just to find on its own. It does have an official English translation, but it was never uploaded with the rest of the Viz manga, and to the best of my knowledge, the only way to read it is by purchasing one of the physical manga box sets, which are not cheap at all, and that's a shame, because by far the most accessible way to read Chapter 0 is through online scans, which don't have, amazing translations, as we'll see in a bit, but especially in this case because Chapter 0 was released in 2009, and scans released in 2009 were, I should say that Chapter 0 does have an anime adaptation called Episode 0, but this has similar problems. It's not on Crunchyroll with the rest of One Piece, and it can only be viewed through fan subs on less than reputable websites, which very much has the same problem as the manga. The translations and the video quality, not great, so you really do have to dig deep to find out about this event. And once you have dug deep and greedily, you then need to sift through the inaccuracies presented by the fan subs, the scans, and even the officially translated English media if you can find it, because just like what happens in real history sometimes, we have 3 different sources that do not agree about how the following event transpired. For example, the name of this fictional historical event itself is often the first point of confusion, and you'll often hear this event, no wait, that's a lie, very few people talk about this, but when they do, a lot of people just refer to it as the Ed War, in the same sort of way that we call the Battle of Marineford the Paramount War. However, the confusing part is that in this case, Ed War is a location. The war part of Ed War is just a coincidence, and one that has conflicting translations in English. In the scanlations, which are again by far the most accessible way of reading it in English, Ed War is referred to as an island. It is reported that Roger and Shiki have made contact off the coast of Ed War. However, in the officially translated and almost impossible to find manga, it is referred to as the Ed War Bay. However, in the anime adaptation of Chapter 0, it's called the Ed War Ocean. So we have an island, a bay, or an ocean. No one can exactly agree on what Ed War is. However, I personally think that the anime is the closest because the Ed part of Ed War is likely taken from the concept of an eddy, which is a turbulent circular current of ocean, and one that could be a seasonal or even permanent fixture somewhere in the wacky world of weather that is One Piece. We also never get to see an island or a bay, so it does seem likely that this battle took place in an unimaginably dangerous patch of ocean. Not an ideal battleground for either side, but it was one that was chosen out of a combination of strategy and desperation. Like many, if not all, events from the era of Legends, the inciting incident that manifested the Battle of Ed War was something that Gol D. Roger did. In this case, Roger had discovered the location of one of the 3 ancient weapons, word of which quickly spread to every other major pirate in the New World at the time, including the instigator of this battle, Golden Lion Shiki. And when this was published in 2009, that was a fairly reasonable and irrefutable discovery. However, now with the power of 15 years of foresight, it does raise the question of, well, which ancient weapon was it? Because all 3 of them have some historical issues. The weapon I'm 100% certain it could not have been is Poseidon, primarily because Poseidon is an ability inherited by the Ryugu royalty. It's the power to communicate with and command sea kings, which pops up seemingly arbitrarily through the generations of Fishman royalty. However, at this point in time, Poseidon's next user, Princess Shirahoshi, hadn't been born yet, and the Battle of of Ed War also took place 2 years before Roger would hear Charlie's prophecy about her birth. So he had no idea who Poseidon was going to be. In fact, he didn't even know where it was going to be, because the Roger pirates also hadn't at the time found the poneglyph on Skypiea that revealed the location of Poseidon. That one was only found during their final journey with Kozuki Oden. So Poseidon is completely ruled out as a possibility. It's also highly unlikely to have been Uranus, the mysterious sky weapon capable of obliterating entire islands through the power of the Mother Flame, and it's unlikely because this weapon is in possession of the world government and may very well be what is referred to as the national treasure, something that they've been hanging on to for an awfully long time. However, they were unable to actually use it until its fuel source was successfully replicated, which is what Dr. Vegapunk accidentally went on to do as part of his dream to provide free, limitless energy to everyone around the world. Unlike Poseidon, though, we can't 100% rule Uranus out. It's possible that Roger found it and Uranus was then later commandeered by the world government, but at the moment, the simpler explanation is that Uranus is a weapon that the world government have had command of since the conclusion of the Void Century, which brings us to what I think is the most likely candidate, Pluton. Now, at first, this seems tricky as well because we now know that Pluton is buried deep beneath Wano, and at this point, Roger had not yet visited Wano. In fact, we don't even know if Roger ever went to Wano. Odin was picked up by Whitebeard and Roger dropped Odin off alone to quickly take a bit of a rubbing of their road poneglyph. So as far as we know, Roger never went to Wano. However, Pluton's location is detailed on the poneglyph within the Alabaster Tomb, which is implied to be one of the poneglyphs that Roger had managed to find prior to recruiting Kozuki Oden, because it wasn't on the stops of their Round World Mystery Cube tour. However, as far as we know, Roger has even less of a connection to Alabaster than he did to Wano, and we've only ever heard of the slightest, maybe speculative connection between Roger and King Cobra, and that tiny shred of information also came to us from Chapter 0. We see one panel of Cobra reacting to the news of Roger's execution several years after the Battle of Ed War, and he remarks that a terrible age has begun, which also comes with its own piece of confusion which relentlessly attacks the mind-brains of those who did manage to find Chapter 0, which is that also in this panel is who appears to be Nefertari Vivi, which is that's rather shocking because she wasn't even born at the time of Roger's execution. And I have seen this cited as a continuity error by Oda, but this is actually Vivi's mother, Nefertari Titi, who passed away due to the incurable condition of being a mother in One Piece. Although to be fair to anyone who mistakes her for Vivi, she does look very different from the only other time that Titi has been drawn in the manga. That aside, we also do know that Cobra, Vivi, and maybe Titi as well were all members of the D-Clan, which is another mind-brain melting moment, because Vivi looks exactly like Titi, who looks exactly like their ancestor Nefertari D. Lily. So who exactly in this family is the descendant of Lily? Is it Cobra, Titi, or both? And we have a bit of an enhanced emphasis on family values in the Alabaster royalty, maybe. Setting that aside, for now I think it's reasonable to propose that somewhere in history, Roger encountered King Cobra and Cobra assisted this D-connection. He showed him the Alabaster poneglyph, Roger went, cool, because of course Roger couldn't read poneglyphs, so there was limited amounts that he could do with this. However, Cobra did know that Pluton's location was detailed there, and he could have told Roger, which is information that was then somehow spread throughout the world, resulting not only in our upcoming Battle of Ed War, but also this is likely how Crocodile discovered that Alabaster was connected to Pluton, and why 2 decades later he began a civil war in the desert nation to attain it. But let's turn our attention back to main antagonist Golden Lion Shiki. Shiki, along with apparently everything in this video, is a perpetually confusing character who exists in a space that I call Schrodinger's canon. He both is and isn't canon at the same time. The simplest way to state it is that everything in Chapter 0 and his subsequent flashback manga appearances are canon, but everything in One Piece film's Strong World is not canon. But as for what happened, Shiki is yet another Rocks Pirate alumni who splintered off and started his own crew after the destruction of the Rocks Pirates during the God Valley incident. And history views Shiki as one of the lesser known Rocks Pirates. He didn't go on to have the sheer impact that names like Edward Newgate, Charlotte Lin, and Kaido would. And that's because history can be rather cruel. Because at this point in time, 27 years ago, Shiki wasn't just a big name, he was the big name. It was said that he had the largest fleet of any pirate of that era, and even though we can't properly quantify it, he may very well have had the largest fleet in pirating history. So Shiki had a fleet of 51 ships, and each of those ships contained a separate division of his forces. So he had at least 51 divisions within the Golden Lion Pirates. Now, in terms of sheer scale, compare that to the Whitebeard pirates, an absolutely colossal crew commanded by an Emperor of the Sea, and they only had 16 divisions. So Shiki's fleet was approximately 3 times larger, although it's unknown what the qualitative strength of his commanders were. In the manga, we only really see 3 of them. We've got this guy, that guy, and this not guy, who, fun tangent, was once the target of a bizarrely popular Big Mom theory, which is that she is Big Mom. Remember that this was 2009, so about a million years before Big Mom was actually revealed to us. And these were the kind of scraps that we had to sustain ourselves with. But the only other known commander of the Golden Lion Pirates is Largo, the main antagonist of the Little East Blue arc, which was a tie-in to the Strong World movie and also non-canon. But Largo was said to be the commander of the 51st Division that went on to form his own crew known as the Amigo Pirates, because, I don't know if you've noticed, but Largo has a very subtle Mexican aesthetic going on. He also had a devil fruit that allowed him to create nets, like really sticky nets. It was rather unpleasant. And even though he isn't canon and we should forget about him immediately after I finish the sentence, Largo is the only known display of power that we've had from a Golden Lion commander, which does not bode well for their future in this battle. However, Shiki had not actually planned on fighting Roger directly, or in fact at all. He actually set sail and intercepted Roger to propose an alliance. A very aggressive alliance with the threat of being attacked by 51 ships if Roger refused, but Shiki wanted to join forces with Roger, to combine his, at the time, unmatched manpower with Roger's knowledge specifically of their ancient weapon, which Shiki wanted to use to rule the world. Shiki's broader goal was something world domination, the same as his former captain Roxty Zebek. But this meeting was a worrying development, and one that we've seen examples of since. The world government live in perpetual terror of 2 emperors of the sea joining forces, because they only have the power to fight against one emperor at a time, which is why the meeting between Shanks and Whitebeard was so heavily monitored, with the world government fully prepared to go to war should an alliance be formed. And the same worry was expressed 2 years after that, when Big Mom and Kaido formed an alliance on Wano, which would have resulted in a force that the Marines could never have even hoped to measure up to. But that was stopped during the raid on Onigashima, before the 2 empires could properly unite. Now, Roger did, of course, refuse Shiki's offer, because Roger had no desire to rule the seas, let alone the world. He very much had the Luffy philosophy on freedom. He may have been a king, but Roger was no conqueror. And so Roger and his singular vessel of a handful of men geared up and prepared to fight the largest pirate fleet in the world all on their own. So there was no alliance on this day. But what happened with Shiki and Roger was an early example of emperor politics that has shaped so much of modern One Piece. Although as far as we know, neither Shiki nor Roger was an emperor of the sea. Although they could have been, especially Shiki, because even if he wasn't, he did possess the power and influence that would form the criteria of an emperor. So whether or not he had the title, or even whether or not the titles existed at that point, Golden Lion Shiki was effectively an emperor of the sea. And so panic ensued when word of this meeting reached the Marines, after which point Fleet Admiral Kong immediately mobilized a force led by Admiral Sengoku and comprised of many now legendary names, including Kuzan, Sakazuki, Suru, Jaguar D. Sol. And even though he wasn't ordered to, Monkey D. Garb also decided to head out on this mission because it involved an opportunity to catch Roger. And just as a reminder of who else was already involved in this incident on Roger's side, on board he had Silver's Rayleigh, Copacabana, a very young Shanks, as well as Buggy, so 2 era-appropriate legends and 2 future legends who would eventually become Emperors of the Sea. This had the potential to become another God Valley incident, where almost every major global power collided with one another. However, as it would turn out, the Marines wouldn't even have time to reach the Edwar battleground, because this battle was over almost as immediately as it began. After a brief exchange of fierce battle combat, the choice of venue would be heavily called into question, because Edwar, as mentioned previously, was almost certainly a colossal and volatile eddy, and the weather took a sharp turn to the apocalyptic, and within a moment, half of Shiki's fleet had been sunk, about 25 ships gone in an instant, and forcing the call to retreat. But not before Shiki received a rather unique injury, as a rogue steering wheel was lodged in his head. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Shiki lost this battle the moment he started it. And I imagine that choosing to intercept Roger at Edwar was designed as a show of power, a grand gesture to display how Shiki controls these seas, but it backfired. It backfired big time. As it turns out, Shiki could not control the ocean, and it turned his certain victory victory into an unimaginable defeat, and the collapse of an empire so embarrassing that one of the most influential and powerful men of this entire era has been reduced to a comical footnote of history. Had Shiki made, let's say, a more reasonable choice, let's say a calmer territory, then Roger's defeat here would have been all but guaranteed. So Roger escaped, and in the aftermath of the battle, Shiki scrambled what remaining forces he had, but he was no longer the ruling faction of the New World, and he would rapidly lose power until one day he decided to throw it away entirely during a one-man raid of Marineford. This was very much a protest raid because Shiki was enraged that Roger had been captured and scheduled to be executed in East Blue, aka the weakest of all of the seas in the world. And when I said before that Roger's defeat was all but guaranteed if Shiki had made better choices, this is where we see the truth of that. Because what it took to bring Shiki down was a combination of both Garp and Sengoku, and even then this fight destroyed half of Marineford before Shiki was finally subdued. He was a very serious individual power, and I think a lot of people tend to equate him to the Shiki that we see in the Strong World film, but that doesn't even begin to depict what this man was capable of. However, following this, Shiki was imprisoned in Impel Down. However, he became the first recorded person, not the first person, but recorded person to escape from the Great Prison, scribbling his name onto the Great Graffiti Wall of History one last time, as after this he vanished into obscurity. His last words were a claim that he had a plan to create hell on earth, and this is the plan that we're still waiting for him to enact to this very day. Approximately 1 year ago in the New World, the One Piece planet was quite literally rocked by a rather shocking event known as the Payback War. This conflict saw the remnants of the Whitebeard pirates led by Marco the Phoenix launch a full-scale attack on the growing empire of Marshall D. Teach in a fight battle that would go on to decide the future of the world. This is the story of the Payback War. And it's one of those events that can be a little bit difficult to explain because of how much context is required. This isn't a one-off incident that just happened out of nowhere. What it is, right, is it's a knock-on of a knock-on of a knock-on and probably of a knock-on of that. The seeds of which actually go all the way back to the era of legends, at least with Roxy Xebec. I'm not going to go over his whole life in this video, what little we know of it, but what's important to know is that our modern-day Marshall D. Teach has inherited the will of Rox, and for 20 years Teach, now known as Blackbeard, was a subordinate of Whitebeard who was a member of the Rox Pirates, which you may think would give Blackbeard some level of loyalty towards Whitebeard, and you would be hilariously wrong. Because after fellow crew member Thatch discovered a certain fruit known as the Yami Yami no Mi, which was a Darkness Logia devil fruit, Blackbeard immediately murdered him, absconded with the magical fruit, and set into motion a series of events that would culminate in an event known as the Paramount War, which was the final stand of Whitebeard. But this wasn't your run-of-the-mill betrayal. Because the key thing to remember about Whitebeard is that his crew was structured as a family. It was Whitebeard's dream to build a family. He called all of his crew members sons, and Blackbeard was one of those precious sons. And so what happened here was a case of fictional fratricide, with Blackbeard killing Thatch, his own brother. And this is an act that the Whitebeard pirates would never forgive, and a huge driving force for them all the way up to the events of the Payback War. In essence, the Payback War was a family feud between sons that played out on an unbelievably large scale and became the biggest conflict that the world had seen since the Paramount War occurred approximately a year beforehand. As stated before, the Paramount War concluded with the death of Whitebeard, which created a rather nasty power vacuum in the New World. At the time, Whitebeard was one of the 4 emperors, a sort of naturally developed system that enforced balance at the highest levels of fictional piracy, because one emperor couldn't attack another without one or both of the remaining emperors stepping in to take advantage of the situation, which up until very recently has kept the world in a perpetual stalemate, with no pirate able to make progress towards the ultimate pirate goal of becoming the Pirate King, which actually worked out rather well for Whitebeard, and you might say that this was his intention all along, as he was never trying to become the Pirate King, and in fact he was acting as more of a caretaker, waiting for the man who would go on to complete Roger's will. However, the caretaker dying is a bit of a problem, because once that happens you'll find that your home falls into immediate disrepute, and so every territory that had been previously under the protection of Whitebeard was now more or less up for grabs following his death. And what proceeded to happen from here was an arms race to gobble up that delicious territory, as well as for new contenders to proudly shout their names in an effort to claim that newly vacant emperor spot. For example, of this, Fishman Island would eventually be claimed by fellow Emperor of the Sea Big Mom, and an island called Food Volton would be taken by the great Brownbeard, who tried to make a name for himself, which is understandable because his real name is Tadros Higliges. I genuinely don't know how to say this name. Higliges. Higliges? It doesn't matter how it's said, what matters is that it's a very clever pun in Japanese using the components of the word brownbeard to form a larger name. And in English, the closest equivalent we have would be something like Browndros Rodriguez. But when it came down to it, the brownbeards of the world were never in serious contention. And there were only two people who were ever going to inherit the title of emperor. One of which would be the aforementioned Blackbeard, the man who caused all of this to begin with. And the other primary, and many would say preferable candidate, was Whitebeard's former 1st Division commander Marco the Phoenix, who became the leader of what was left of the Whitebeard pirates following the Paramount War. And what happened here is actually a very interesting intersection on a graph, because the Whitebeard pirates, they suffered a pretty astonishing defeat at their Marineford, and so they were on their way down. But simultaneously, the Blackbeard pirates, they suffered a success, and they were on their way up, with the two meeting in the middle. But something I should clarify is that, unlike many crew inheritance scenarios, it's never stated that Marco became the new captain of the Whitebeard pirates. Yes, he was their leader, but they don't appear to have had a concrete structure, and I think that's quite indicative of their strength, will, and organization going into this conflict. They were barely holding together as a crew. Without Whitebeard, they were severely lacking in leadership, and they were also lacking in his raw strength to protect all of their territories. However, there was one island that was non-negotiable, one island that the Whitebeard pirates would sacrifice everything to keep. Now, as initially presented to us, the Payback War was an effort of vengeance launched by Marco, like a much larger scale version of Ace's quest to find Blackbeard and avenge the murder of Thatch. However, the actual cause is a bit more complicated and a lot more heartbreaking than that, because the catalyst of the Payback War was a tiny, and as far as the rest of the world is concerned, completely irrelevant location called Sphinx Island in the New World. Now, Sphinx isn't a hugely interesting location for pirates, marines, or other travelers these days, because it's a nation composed of ruins with a population of 0, which is exactly what they want you to think. Because on this island, there's a secret village hidden behind a waterfall. A village that is quite possibly the most peaceful location on the entire One Piece planet, and that's because Whitebeard spent his entire life building it for that purpose. So Whitebeard, he grew up on the old incarnation of Sphinx Island, and back in his day, 60, 70 years ago, Sphinx was in quite a bad state, because they were extremely poor and didn't have the funds required to pay a heavenly tribute to join the world government. And that is a very big problem, because Sphinx is located deep within the New World, which is already dangerous enough, but with no world government protection, it became a farming ground for pirates, slavers, thieves, and other ne'er-do-wells. And it was considered a lawless zone where the nation would be frequently sacked, rebuilt again, etc. And just play that on a loop. And this cycle happened so regularly that it created distinct generations of what became known as Sphinx orphans. Because after every sacking, the adults in the village would either be killed or enslaved, leaving only the children behind to rebuild. And that's part of the reason why Whitebeard set out to sea to begin with. Yes, he had his personal dream of building a family, but he also used every berry he made plundering to fund, build, and maintain this secret Sphinx village. Because in the words of a very large cat, in a dirty world, there's no good or bad money, it's just money. And it's also very likely that Whitebeard to some degree actually used his devil fruit powers to create this hidden village. And so what Sphinx Island represents today is the legacy of Whitebeard, which led to the desire of the remaining Whitebeard pirates to protect it, and also to the desire of Blackbeard to attack and destroy what remained of his former captain, because he's a prick. But the exact beginning of the Payback War is a little bit vague. Marco does state that Blackbeard invaded Sphinx Island, and in retaliation, the remnants of the Whitebeard pirates banded together to start the Payback War as a defensive maneuver, which is not how this event is known in the rest of the world. Whenever the Payback War is mentioned by those who weren't there to experience it, it's always told as a very bloodthirsty affair led by Marco, who just wanted to avenge his captain, and to be fair, that also. In fact, to this very day, Marco still says that he wants Blackbeard to pay for what he did, but this wasn't a superfluous conflict. It did have a core purpose, which was to protect this delightful little village. And in order to do so, the Whitebeard pirates mustered everything they had left, which was a core crew of 1,600 men, and when I say that, I mean men. There were no women on this crew, and they were all led by the remaining division commanders, including notable figures such as Diamond Jozu Vista of the Flower Swords, Pockets in His Face Flamenco, and Never Got a Cool Nickname Izo, among others, many others. There's a lot of commanders, and this force is no joke. But it's also been implied that it wasn't just a conflict with the core crew, and the extended New World captains reunited once more for the Payback War. These guys are the Whitebeard equivalent of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, and includes a lot of former members of the core crew like Whitey Bay, who who to this day is still the only known female member of the Whitebeard Pirates, apart from Kozuki Toki, I guess. But now prepare yourselves for big names, because also joining the Payback War was Pavlik Amadob, Bagali, Sleepy, Forlibs, Great Michael, Kolskin, and Thunderlord Magai, among others, so many others, all of whom were allegedly very big shot captains in the New World. But the point is that we're talking about a fighting force in the multiple thousands being represented by the side of Whitebeard. And what we know of Blackbeard is that he brought an equally as large army to the battlefield, and it's my personal speculation that Blackbeard may have acquired this army after he successfully commandeered the island of Hachinosu during the Rocky Port incident. That was where former Rocks Pirates member Ochoku was defeated, and Blackbeard became the new pirate overlord, inheriting thousands upon thousands of pirates who had made Hachinosu their home. So look, there are battles that have played out that have been much larger scale than this. The Paramount War, for example, featured at least 100,000 Marines, but that is very rare. And it may not necessarily feel like it, but the raid on Onigashima saw the Straw Hats and their forces take on 30,000 combatants working under Kaido. So the Payback War, it might seem a bit cute compared to that, but this event was still massive. However, when describing the Payback War, Nico Robin uses the term obliterated to describe the outcome. But I don't know if that's entirely fair, because on paper this was a very even conflict, and I would even say that the Whitebeard Pirates would have gone into it with an advantage, primarily because they knew how to fight cohesively, whereas the Blackbeard Pirates are more of a force of anarchy. Plus, the Whitebeard Pirates also knew the battlefield, and Blackbeard's core crew at the time were not all that impressive. Remember that this was either before or during the Great Devil Fruit Hunt, so most of the crew still had yet to be powered up to their final forms. But it would not be an exaggeration to say that this war was decided by one man, and it's not an exaggeration to say because that's exactly what Marco said. In the end, everything came down to Blackbeard and the fact that he had acquired Whitebeard's former devil fruit, the Gura Gura no Mi, a paramecia type that allows its users to create shockwaves so devastating that it has been said to be capable of quite literally destroying the world. And the Whitebeard Pirates, led by Marco, didn't have a counter to this ability, an ability that they were used to fighting alongside, not against, which put them in an even worse position than most major pirates on the planet. Because in the case of figures like Big Mom and Kaido, they at least have experience fighting against this power. So this devil fruit alone would not overcome them, but Marco and the Whitebeard Pirates had never even had to mentally conceive of how they would deal with this fruit. And so they were, as Nico Robin says, obliterated. And this was the final full stop on the story of the Whitebeard Pirates. Following this, the surviving crew members scattered to parts of the world that have only been described as wide and unknown. So unknown that following this event, we've only encountered 2 members out of the thousands that once comprised the most fearsome pirate crew on the planet. And it's just crazy to think that all of these heavy hitters have completely vanished. How could this world possibly go on without Great Michael? Well, it found a way, although it's not an outcome that anyone else wanted. But with Marco soundly defeated, the world had no choice but to recognize Blackbeard as the 4th Emperor of the Sea. And balance would be restored for about a year before Luffy and the Straw Hats returned and ruined everything. That is a different story though. But in regards to the former Whitebeard Pirates, one of the 2 members that we have encountered since is 16th Division Commander Izo, a man who had a bounty of 510 million berries, was a native of Wano and a former vassal of Kozuki Oden. And one of the biggest questions with Izo is, what was he doing this whole time? Why didn't he just return to Wano, which was currently being ruled by Kaido? Well, one explanation is that Wano was visited by Ace, and Izo could have heard about all of the fake Kozuki vassal deaths from Ace, with Izo believing that everyone was gone and there was nothing left on Wano for him to return to. But eventually, Izo heard an alternative fact and decided to return to Wano, as he took part in the raid on Onigashima and died in a battle against a CP0 member named Maha, very much continuing the morbid and tragic legacy of the Whitebeard Pirates, and leaving us with just one known member to linger on, being Marco himself, who also participated in the raid but survived. But one big question mark I do have about the Payback War in general is the status of Sphinx Island. Following the conflict, Marco effectively retired from piracy and became a doctor in the secret village, which Blackbeard apparently didn't destroy despite invading Sphinx Island, which again was the catalyst for this war in the first place, and Blackbeard also won the war, meaning that there was nothing that could have stopped him destroying it. My best guess is that the Sphinx village was hidden so well that the Blackbeard Pirates just never found it. But also, if Marco decided to summon the full force of the Whitebeard Pirates to defend it, then you would think that maybe Blackbeard might have looked a little bit harder. Because it doesn't appear to be too hard to find, as some dude named Rattel found it and led a marine assault on the village in the hopes of finding some more tangible treasure left by Whitebeard. And this happened during the time that Mako was away participating in the raid on Onigashima. But Edward Weevil, the alleged son and likely botched clone of Whitebeard, stepped in to defend the village, which resulted in them calling Admiral Greenbull to apprehend Weevil. And again, despite winning, the invaders of Sphinx Village just decided to leave it alone. It's been a very lucky little village. But Mako has not been a very lucky little birdie and is finding it quite difficult to retire, as this event may once again drag him off the island to deal with a potential Edward Weevil rescue mission, as he is also the legacy of Whitebeard in some way, shape, or form. But even though it was a brutal, humiliating, and history-making loss, the remnants of the Whitebeard pirates did complete what they set out to do. It cost them everything, but launching the Payback War did preserve the Sphinx Village in an act that I'm going to describe as somehow. And this war has played an important role in setting the stage for the final conflict of One Piece. Although in this case, I'd say it's done a lot more to prop up the antagonistic forces of Blackbeard than it has done to assist the dawn of the world being brought about by Luffy, if it's done anything to assist that at all. But that is the story of the Payback War. To the world, this event is known as a futile quest for vengeance, but to everyone who matters, this was a successful effort to preserve the legacy and will of Edward Newgate. 2 years ago, one of the most important fight battles in One Piece world history took place. An event that we've never seen with our own eyes, but have heard about with our own eyes, I guess, because we've read about it in a fictional pirate comic. But unlike many of other previous historical landmarks, this was a rather intimate affair featuring only two combatants, Kuzan and Sakazuki, fighting each other for the right to become the next fleet admiral of the Marines, to dictate their ideal visions of justice, and to, no exaggeration, save the world. This is the story of Kuzan versus Sakazuki, which is a much longer tale than most people give it credit for. It's very likely that Kuzan and Sakazuki have had a bit of a rough history all throughout their careers with the Marines. However, the first big step towards this historical battle occurred 20 years ago beforehand on the island of Ohara. Kuzan and Sakazuki were summoned as two of the 5 vice admirals in charge of the Bust Call ordered on Ohara, a rather extreme operation designed to completely destroy the island itself. And it's quite an interesting stroke of fate that both Kuzan and Sakazuki were there on that day, because they're not the ones that I guess we tend to focus on with that particular story. However, these two vice admirals had far more impact on the Ohara incident and its ensuing consequences than anyone else. And this event featured both of them fighting a battle of justice by proxy, with Kuzan's sense of justice not permitting him to stop the genocide, but prompting him to ensure the survival of Nico Robin, while Sakazuki's justice saw him orchestrate events to ensure that lives were erased from this world that weren't necessarily his to command. If you're ever rereading the Robin flashback for whatever reason, maybe you just enjoy feeling immense pain because you're weird, but when doing so, I really want you to focus on the dialogue of Kuzan and Sakazuki, because it's quite enlightening. The big point of controversy is, of course, that Sakazuki ordered the killing of the civilians of Ohara, the completely innocent civilians, not those nasty scholars who had broken the law. And the reason why he did this is because, quote, "If you're gonna do it, finish the job. If by chance even a single scholar is hiding out in that ship, all of this sacrifice will be for naught. You must destroy evil at its very roots." Which I find fascinating, because Kuzan, he wasn't there to hear that statement. He was actually on the island at the time. But what he ended up doing was exactly what Sakazuki was attempting to prevent. Kuzan saved Nico Robin, a singular scholar, and as a result of that, the sacrifice on Ohara was, exactly as Sakazuki said, all for naught. Because Robin's survival has often been associated with the mantra of Ohara lives, with Robin on her own carrying the will and the work of her people. And it's almost as if Kuzan did this deliberately to spite Sakazuki's brand of justice, as he does say to Robin that sometimes the idea of justice can turn people mad. And he goes on to wonder what the seed of Nico Robin would eventually grow up to become. So in a way, Kuzan does actually agree with Sakazuki's views. He understands that letting Robin go would negate what was done on Ohara. The difference is that Kuzan didn't necessarily believe that the seed being planted here was evil. He's very uncertain. And with that uncertainty, he could not bring himself to take an act of such permanence. Because Kuzan is an ever-evolving man, and his idea of justice is quite fluid as well, such as when speaking to former Vice Admiral Jaguar D. Sol on Ohara, Kuzan said, "Justice changes shape depending on one's standpoint. That's why I won't criticize your idea of justice. However, if you're going to interfere with our work, I cannot ignore that." And it's very easy to transform this quote into Sakazuki's opposing ideal of justice, choice, which would be, justice is solid and objective regardless of one's standpoint. That's why I will criticize your idea of justice, and if you're going to interfere with my work, I cannot ignore that. But Kuzan's original line is one of my favorite quotes, especially the part about Kuzan not criticizing someone else's idea of justice, because it just so happens to change shape depending on where you stand, and other people are standing not where Kuzan is, one of them Sakazuki. But right after saying this, Kuzan is immediately confronted by Sakazuki's idea of justice when he murdered the innocent civilians of Ohara, and this would be a formative moment for Kuzan, as this would force him to criticize someone else's view of justice, to the point where 20 years later, Kuzan would go on to fight the toughest battle of his life in the name of that criticism. Before we leave Ohara though, their respective involvement tells you quite a bit about their beliefs in justice. Even though both of them were part of the same mission with the same goal, Ohara was very personal for Kuzan, and he took the step, quite literally, of being actively involved on the island whilst the Buster Call was in progress, whereas Sakazuki made an active effort to disconnect himself from the risk of humanity. He stayed on the ship, he kept his distance from any potential moral issues, and made sure to carry out a cold and calculated plan, which we should also address in the mild irony of their respective devil fruits. Kuzan is the user of an ice logia, but he generates more personal warmth than Sakazuki, the user of a magma logia. We have a situation where the hot guy's cold-hearted and the cold guy is warm-hearted, and so Eiichiro Oda has set these characters up as opposites in every way he possibly could, right down to that hot versus cold elemental clash. In the wise words of modern-day poet Katy Perry, you're hot and you're cold, you're yes and you're no, you're in and you're out, you're up and you're down, you're wrong when it's right, etc. Goes on like that. This is a song about Kuzan and Sakazuki. She just couldn't use them in the music video due to copyright reasons. However, I should say that there was a point where these two weren't necessarily destined to fight, and things could have gone very differently. And that would be the Water 7 era of One Piece. Had things gone slightly differently here, then I firmly believe that Kuzan would have started to be won over by Sakazuki's justice, and that is all because of Nico Robin. 20 years after saving her, the seed of Nico Robin, it had grown, and it started to look like a very evil tree. Robin moved from organization to organization, destroying each one, and eventually ended up with Crocodile at Baroque Works, which could have led to them finding the ancient weapon Pluton and having the power to quite literally destroy the world. And to Kuzan, that knowledge must have been quite confronting, that the little girl you let escape that day may be dooming the world as we speak. And it was a great argument in favor of Sakazuki's philosophy, because if Robin had just died that day, then the world never would have come close to that threat. And it's evident that Kuzan was reluctantly accepting that when he gave Robin's location to CP9 and even gave their leader Spandam the power of ordering a Buster Call in his effort to capture and execute Nico Robin. However, the ensuing Enislobby incident brought Kuzan back from that particular justice cliff. The Straw Hats declared war against the world government and invaded Enislobby to save a single life, something that in the grand scheme of justice very rarely gets considered within the Marines, as most philosophies of justice focus on the bigger picture of global peace and stability. But seeing the extent that the Straw Hats went to enact their own personal sense of justice did give Kuzan hope that he did the right thing on that day on Ohara by letting Robin live. To quote him yet again, justice changes shape depending on where you stand. So he's not going to criticize the actions of the Straw Hats, even though it dealt a massive blow to the organization of justice that Kuzan had pledged himself to uphold. Although to this very day, Kuzan still isn't convinced about whether letting Robin live was the right or wrong thing to do, and he has asked Robin to answer that question for him. And I think that sums up Kuzan pretty perfectly. If I had to choose one symbol to represent him, that symbol would be a big ol' question mark. Kuzan is a man of great uncertainty. His solid ice powers do not reflect his very malleable beliefs, and this is another core difference between Kuzan and Sakazuki. It is a clash of uncertainty versus certainty. And so far, this video was mostly focused on the thoughts of Kuzan, and that's because there's a lot more complexity at play there that needs to be explored. Kuzan is a man constantly asking questions and re-evaluating his position based on those answers or lack of answers, whereas Sakazuki is an iron wall of willpower. Throughout the pre-time skip era of One Piece, there's not actually a lot to say about him, because it's a very simple case of a man who states his beliefs and then carries them out without any mental or moral complications. Physically, Sakazuki is the unstoppable force, and mentally, he is the immovable object. It's usually not great to have both those things be the same person, which is very much on display throughout the Paramount War. After Kuzan and Kizaru head to the front lines, Sakazuki is the last admiral remaining in position below the execution platform, and he actually chastises both of his colleagues for leaving because a key position of value has been left undefended. defended. I should say the reason why Kuzan left was to stop Whitebeard's tsunami. Kuzan used his ice abilities to protect the Marines, while Sakazuki generally used his powers to rain magma fists down upon the battlefield, which distinguished neither friend nor foe. And he even went out of his way during the war to purge Marines that were abandoning the battlefield, viewing them as unworthy agents of justice and an active hindrance to his ideals. So if you were an average Marine on this battlefield, as say Kobe and Telmeppo were, then Sakazuki was just as much your enemy as Whitebeard was. In fact, you'd be more likely to be killed by Sakazuki than by any of the pirates that you're fighting for the sake of justice. And we also shouldn't ignore the similarities between Marineford and Enies Lobby from Kuzan's perspective. The Straw Hats invaded a world government stronghold to save a single crew member from being executed, and the Whitebeard pirates did exactly the same thing, just on a much larger scale. The reasons for execution were even quite similar. Robin was being executed because of her lineage and her very existence being a threat to the world government, and Ace's very existence as the son of the Pirate King was also considered a threat to the world government. And so there's a definite pattern emerging here of justice taking the form of punishing those who exist adjacent to what has been defined as evil and unjust, which is exactly Sakazuki's view. He believes that evil is genetic, and that simply being born the child of a criminal makes that child innately evil. And even though the Marines won the Paramount War, it's difficult to say that justice was enacted that day. It's a hard conclusion to come to. And this was Kuzan's third strike. Ohara, Enies Lobby, and now Marineford had made it clear that the current direction of the Marines was not his vision of justice. And there would be only one opportunity to change this, which was with the retirement of Fleet Admiral Sengoku, who did nominate Kuzan as his successor for the position. However, a group of people referred to as dignitaries within the world government endorsed Sakazuki, which shouldn't be particularly surprising for a couple of reasons. One, his whole view about genetics and evil is very much in line with the purity beliefs of the world nobles. And two, Sakazuki was the hero of Marineford. He fought Whitebeard, he executed Ace. From a certain perspective, he was the clear candidate to attain leadership. And with the authority of the world government dignitaries, that should have been the end of the matter. However, Kuzan objected. Having spent multiple decades at this point grappling with Sakazuki's justice, having gone from a man determined not to criticize anyone else's view, to a man whose own personal sense of justice was now solid enough to stand against something that he, at his core, knew was not justice. And many people in World saw the ensuing battle as an individual fight for power and positioning, but these two men agreed to a fight to the death, not for the sake of deciding who was going to be the next fleet admiral, but because Kuzan and Sakazuki each saw this as a fight to save the world, their vision of the world. What Kuzan saw was the death of justice in Sakazuki, and what Sakazuki saw in Kuzan was a man who would continue and even foster the growth of the seeds of evil, forever preventing justice from prevailing. And in a sense, they were both right, because this does go back to Doflamingo's infamous speech during Marineford. Are the pirates the bad guys? Is the Navy the good guys? Things like that change with the seasons. Kids who have never known peace and kids who have never known war have completely different ideas of right and wrong. It's the job of those at the top to decide what's good and what's evil. Right now, it could go either way. Justice will prevail, of course, because the side of justice will be whichever side wins. So both Kuzan and Sakazuki knew that. Although I would say that in retrospect, both of them were being quite naive, as each of them thought that victory here would allow them to change the world, but no matter who won, both were destined to lose, which we'll go over in a bit. However, the island of Punk Hazard was chosen as the battleground, and Punk Hazard is a much more appropriate location than most people give it credit for. It's often seen as an island of convenience because it was deserted, so Kuzan and Sakazuki could fight freely there. However, Punk Hazard is also incredibly symbolic of the world government itself. This is an island where prisoners and slaves were taken and experimented on for the benefit of the world government, so to Kuzan, this island represented everything he was fighting against, and for Sakazuki, it was everything he was trying to protect in the name of absolute justice. This despite the fact that Sakazuki's powers were more suited to destruction, whilst Kuzan's were more suited to protection, but they had opposing missions. And the ensuing battle was one of the longest in One Piece world history, a duel that lasted for 10 days and nights, with such tremendous power on display that it permanently altered the climate of Punk Hazard, turning it into a half-burning, half-freezing hellscape before a clear victor emerged, which would be Sakazuki, who went on to become the next fleet admiral, whilst Kuzan submitted his resignation from the Marines, which I would say is a pretty cool outcome considering that he was supposed to submit his resignation from life. As the most surprising thing about this battle is that Sakazuki spared Kuzan's life, and he went against his own sense of justice. Part of this may have to to do with Sakazuki's genetic evil views. Kuzan, at least as far as we know, wasn't born into a family of criminals, so perhaps Sakazuki saw no need to purge him. However, Kuzan would go on to prove Sakazuki's beliefs in absolute justice by becoming one of the greatest enemies that the world government has ever known. But first, let's talk about justice some more, shall we? Sakazuki became Fleet Admiral and a lot of changes were instituted. Marineford was moved into the New World to take a more active role in administering said justice, and a very aggressive global draft was instituted to give Sakazuki the manpower he needed to seek out this justice. But other than that, he has thus far been completely ineffective in administering his own beliefs. Because as hard as Sakazuki tries, even the leader of the world's largest military is still just a tool of the world nobles. If anything, Sakazuki in this position now has even less freedom to dictate justice than he did as an admiral, and for the first time that we've known him, Sakazuki is now on a path of uncertainty just as Kuzan was. Meanwhile, Kuzan has taken a lot of steps away from that, and a particularly unorthodox one of joining the Blackbeard pirates in his quest for justice, ? And this was a move that was quite confusing until recently. Although Kuzan becoming a pirate, I think that's always made a lot of sense, as Kuzan's life experience to date had showed him that pirates were the ones who upheld his view of justice far more so than the world government. The Straw Hats on Enies Lobby and the Whitebeard pirates at Marineford were both much more palatable invocations of justice than Kuzan's experiences within the Marines, which very much opens the door for Blackbeard, who courted Kuzan by stating, "What else are you gonna do, huh? Chased around by the powers of justice. But in our world, justice takes a different form. Have you got the wrong idea about pirates? Nobody said we're all the best of friends here. The only thing a pirate needs is an alignment of interests. You're a free man. What do you want to do, Kuzan?" And so it's only natural for him to take up that offer, if only to explore the promise of a different system of justice. One that's a lot less rigid and more open than that of the Marines. Kuzan and Blackbeard are definitely not friends, but they do currently share at least part of the same vision, which has to do with destroying the world government. As former Fleet Admiral Sengoku once said, "The island of Marineford is the hub of our world. For all citizens in the world who fear an invasion of evildoers, justice and righteousness will never be defeated. Don't you dare speak lightly of sinking this island." And the person he was talking to, the person who was speaking lightly, was Blackbeard. And with that in mind, Blackbeard is a very natural choice. A man well and truly prepared to destroy the institution that Kuzan viewed as irredeemable and would open up an opportunity for a new vision of justice for the world. 900 years ago, a monarch named Nefertari D. Lily did a bad thing. What she did right is she walked into an area containing 30 stone cubes, which when put together contain the location of Laugh-Tale, the ancient weapons, and the entirety of the true history of the world. And then, according to Mr. Emu, there was a little bit of an accident. I don't know, I guess Lily tripped and fell or something, and knocked these 30 mystery cubes flying all across the planet, so that 900 years later, this information could be gathered and used to bring down the world government. But let's just step back a bit. These 30 stone cubes are known as the poneglyphs, and they were created by the ancient Kozuki clan between 800 and 900 years ago during the Void Century. The crafting of these stones is a skill that's been lost over time, but the Kozuki clan were an unparalleled group of stonemasons who have contributed to the history of the One Piece world in many ways that they'll never be remembered for. One of them would be the advent of sea stone, a mineral that originates from Wano and has since been used to craft a variety of weapons and technologies to assist in battling against Elfra users, as well as traveling across the Calm Belt without being detected by Sea Kings. Sea stone is also said to be as hard as diamond, and certain assumptions from here would state that the Kozuki clan crafted these 30 poneglyphs out of sea stone, which was available only to them at the time. However, we have seen Devil Fruit users interact with poneglyphs on multiple occasions without losing their powers or being noticeably weakened in any way, and given that the poneglyphs are flat out indestructible, it seems more likely that the Kozuki stonemasons came up with an ultimate substance and or process to create the poneglyphs. It's even possible that there's a slightly spiritual element in their creation, because within the One Piece world there is an ability known as the Voice of All Things, and those with the Voice of All Things can allegedly hear the poneglyphs calling out to them as if they're living beings. "Come and read me," they say, and then when you get there it's in a text that you can't read. Absolute literary teasers, these poneglyphs. But this spiritual element may be possible if the poneglyphs were infused with the haki of those who were desperate enough to create them to leave this message. I suppose in a similar way to how the Iron Giant Emmet was left with a knot containing Joy Boy's Haki. It may depend on the will of the user, but it seems that back in the ancient times there was a process to imbue Haki into objects without that Haki dissipating over time, or without needing a continuous stream of Haki flowing into them like we see with many swordsmen in the modern day. However it was completed, this indestructibility has proven to be a great problem for the world government, as even when they have managed to find poneglyphs, they've been completely incapable of destroying them and completing their goal of erasing history. And they have tried every method available to them. With the world government, they have dominion over almost the entire planet, and yet they are completely powerless to destroy a bunch of rocks. Rocks that themselves have the power to undo their 800-year-old empire. But whatever the substance is and however they were created, it's pretty irrelevant compared to the purpose of the words inscribed on the stones, because these 30 poneglyphs are 30 messages that were deemed too important to ever be forgotten or erased by history. But this text also comes with an inbuilt layer of protection, which we've hinted at, as not just anyone can read them, because they are written in a lost ancient language that exceptionally few people have the knowledge and skill to read. So writing systems in One Piece, they've always been a bit left deliberately vague, and most text that we do see in the series appears to be written in simplistic and deliberately unintelligible gibberish to us, in addition to the occasional Japanese and also a surprising amount of English, all of which can be taken as the generic language of the One Piece world, likely universally spoken due to the world government having control of the planet. In fact, there are actually several One Piece novels that go into more detail about this. For example, in Straw Hat Stories, it was said that the world government forced all countries under their flag to abandon their native languages and adopt the universal language, which is then reiterated in One Piece Heroines, where it's stated that everyone who refused to abandon their native languages were turned into slaves of the world nobles. And the reason why this was mandated, in addition to the goal of creating a monoculture, could have been to wipe away any trace of languages even tangentially related to the ancient language. Like how if you speak French, Italian, or Spanish, they're all different, but they have the same roots. So if you speak one of the Romance languages, then you've got a pretty decent chance of at least getting a general idea of what's happening in another that you don't speak. So a big part of this Void Century mission was to erase every trace of this language, which in the modern day has left us with only two and a half people who can read it. The first is Straw Hat archaeologist Nico Robin, who amazingly taught herself to read it by spying on the research of the archaeologists of Ohara, as well as Kozuki Sukiyaki, former shogun of Wano, who inherited the teachings from his father, which may eventually be passed down to current shogun Kozuki Momonosuke. And as for the half, we have Charlotte Pudding, who is a member of the Three-Eyed Tribe, who have a vaguely defined ability to awaken their third eye, and apparently doing so would allow them to read the ancient language. At least that's the bet that Charlotte Linlin was making in her quest to decipher them, and also a bet that Blackbeard is currently making by kidnapping Pudding. However, the ancient language is not exclusive to the poneglyphs, and the ancient script does appear on select few surviving relics throughout the One Piece world, like when Robin discovered the text inscribed within the ruins of Shandora. However, these instances are unbelievably rare, as they weren't inscribed on indestructible objects and were thus very much subject to the destruction of the Void Century, but somehow survived it. And I would say this is a classic example of the world government being their own worst enemy, because they've actively hindered their own progress by wiping out any connections to this ancient language, which means that even they cannot read the poneglyphs, and given that some of them contain the locations of ancient weapons, information that is of great appeal to the world government, it may have been useful not to completely eradicate the language that makes it possible to find them. Some poneglyphs also reveal other very sensitive information that the world government could use to prevent the dawn of the world from ever happening. Although I should say there is a chance that Saint Emu Nerona does know the ancient language, and that's how the world government eventually came into the possession of the ancient weapon Uranus. They may have found that poneglyph and Emu deciphered its location. I don't know, lots of maybes, and we're getting very ahead of ourselves, because it's one thing to know how these stones were created, but the true logistical question is how they were scattered so perfectly and so obscurely around the planet. Moving these stones is an absolute nightmare of a task, and it has been implied by Emu that Nefertari D. Lily was responsible for scattering the poneglyphs, and rather curiously, this is referred to as Lily's great mistake, as if it was an accident. But however it happened, on a certain fateful day, Lily's actions resulted in the quote loathsome poneglyphs being scattered across the planet. Although Emu has since learned that this probably was not a mistake, and one theorized way that Lily could have accomplished this on her own is if she had the powers of the Nikyu Nikyu no Mi, Bartholomew Kuma's modern day devil fruit, which allows him to repel people or objects all over the planet to specific coordinates of his choice. And that would explain why the vast majority of poneglyphs ended up either directly housed by Great Kingdom allies or found their ways to other secluded locations where the world government was unlikely to discover them. And these 30 poneglyphs were divided into 3 distinct types. The first and most common are the instructional poneglyphs. They make up more than half of the mystery cubes in total, and they contain vital instructions to be carried out to continue the legacy of those who wrote them. For example, as stated previously, the locations of at least 2 ancient weapons are inscribed on instructional poneglyphs. These are very important, but the main meat that we're looking for are the historical poneglyphs. These are the stones that contain the true history of the One Piece world. There are 9 all in all, and when put together they form the Ryo poneglyph, which in Japanese literally means the true text of history. However, by far the most exciting of stones are the 4 Red Road poneglyphs, as they detail a series of locations of the planet which, when put together, will reveal the location of the hidden island Laugh Tale, where Joy Boy left the treasure now known as the One Piece. So all in all, the existence of these mystery cubes is very helpful, because they essentially give us a completion rate of One Piece. Once all 30 stones are found, we have 100%ed the game. And at the time of recording this video, we have discovered 15 of the 30 poneglyphs, so over 1,100 chapters and almost 30 years into this story, and what we've done is cleared about 50% of the One Piece world, meaning that at this rate, One Piece will be over somewhere in the region of 2056. So we've got to get a bit faster at finding these bad boys. And previously, when I said we have discovered, I do mean that quite liberally. We as readers have seen exactly 15 poneglyphs across the perspectives of many different characters, but no single character actively searching for them in the modern day has found this many. Although I should say that we have technically seen 16 poneglyphs, however, much like the Lucia Kingdom, one of them never existed. If you watch the anime, this is actually the very first poneglyph you ever see during the Alabasta arc. In episode 102, Zoro falls into a hole or something and ends up in a desert cavern where he and Chopper discover what is theoretically one of the most important objects in the world. This was during the time where the anime were pretty desperate to pack some filler in, and without really knowing what these stones are, they decided to foreshadow the Alabasta poneglyph with a second Alabasta poneglyph. In their defense, there's no way they could have known just how important or scarce these were going to be, and there's also an argument to be made that neither did Eiichiro Oda himself, which is why this was allowed to happen in the first place. And funnily enough, when Nico Robin does find the first actual poneglyph in the series in the Tomb of Kings, she doesn't find the information she's looking for, and she asks, "Are there any other poneglyphs here in Alabasta?" To which all of the anime watching audience reply, "Why yes, Nico Robin, yes there are." However, this poneglyph was protected for centuries by the Nefertari family, as it was an instructional stone that contained the location of the ancient weapon Pluton, and whilst we as readers and watchers don't get let in on it here, this is where Robin learns that Pluton is located on Wano, something that would take us a couple more decades of real-world time to learn at this point. And the second poneglyph we found was quite similar. This stone was entrusted to the Shandians and placed within the golden city of Shandora for protection, but unfortunately this entire city was blown up into the sky by the Knock-Up Stream 400 years ago, making this by far one of the single most difficult poneglyphs to find. And it's another instructional one, this time containing the location of the ancient weapon Poseidon, which resides on Fishman Island. So pre-timeskip Robin was really getting a full spoiler rundown of post-timeskip events, and it's very likely that she has knowledge that we as the audience still don't, due to the island of Ohara where she grew up. Here there was a poneglyph housed within the basement of the Tree of Knowledge being studied by the scholars, and this stone does form part of the set of the 9 Ryo poneglyphs, and the information it contains is the name of the Great Kingdom, the hyper-advanced civilization that existed during the Void Century, and the primary enemy of the 20 kingdoms that came together to eventually form the world government. And Child Robin, mate, she was very busy, because after surviving a genocide, she ended up on another random island, assumedly in West Blue, that just so happened to have a poneglyph there as well, although we have no idea what was written on this one. My guess would be that this stone had already been discovered by the scholars or even Robin's mother, Nico Olvia, and its whereabouts were mentioned somewhere in the research notes that Robin sneakily kept track of. And so when she got booted off Ohara, she went to find it. Because initially it does appear that Robin was intentionally searching for it, and I would love to know what was written on it, but we don't. And here is where things actually get just a little bit more tricky, because this poneglyph may also be the same stone that was found by Roger's crew during Odin's flashback. They stumble upon a poneglyph in an undisclosed location outside in a forest, just like Robin's one, and whilst the forests do look kind of different, they don't look different enough for me to confidently say that these are 2 different poneglyphs. So they may be the same one, and if that is the case, then we've only discovered 14 poneglyphs poneglyphs, which would lower our One Piece completion rate down to 46.6%. But a rather dangerous poneglyph is one that we've never seen because it's located on the island of Hachinosu, which is the pirate paradise currently ruled by Blackbeard, formerly by Ochoku, and formerly to that by Rocksteady Zebek. And we don't know exactly what information is on this stone either, whether it's instructional or whether it's part of the Rio. All we do know is that it is very unlikely to be a road poneglyph. However, it's an extremely important stone nonetheless, and highly likely to be the reason why so many big shot pirates even know about the existence of poneglyphs, because generally what you would need to do is sail all the way to the end of the New World and land at Lodestar Island to be made aware of their existence, which Goldie Roger and his crew did. However, there's never been any record of anyone else reaching Lodestar Island. I mean, they could have, but the issue is that there's not a whole lot of point going there if you already know about the poneglyphs. And so I think it's more likely that the biggest of names, like the Whitebeards, the Kaidos, and the Big Mothers, all knew about poneglyphs because they served under rocks on Hachinosu, where one of them was housed. And this poneglyph was also the catalyst for the Rocky Port incident. Trafalgar D. Waterlaw was hunting for it, which led to a fatesome amount of chaos where he formed an alliance with Blackbeard and Kobe to bring Ochoku down, and whilst I'm sure that Law took a rubbing of the stone, it is now firmly under Blackbeard's control. Most of these poneglyphs were sent to incredibly obscure and isolated locations, or locations that were incredibly difficult to breach. And Fishman Island happens to be both of those, very much out of the way and almost impossible to take by force, which is why it was chosen as a location to originally house not just one, but two poneglyphs, one of which was an extremely important road poneglyph, and the second stone contained an apology letter written by Joy Boy. This second one is notable because it's the only poneglyph so far that seems to contain no relevant information. It's just an apology from Joy Boy to the Fishman for breaking his promise. Meanwhile, another road poneglyph was sent to the Mink allies on Zou, and this was actually the first road poneglyph we encountered in the series, but we would discover another in the possession of Charlotte Linlin on Whole Cake Island. In fact, she had a treasure room with the centerpieces of her collection being not just one, not even two, but three poneglyphs. Now look, 3, it's not a traditionally big number. In fact, there's only 3 numbers smaller than 3, but when there's a total supply of 30, that would mean that at one stage Big Mom controlled 10% of the world's entire poneglyph supply, which is massive. However, one of these stones was found and gifted to her by Jinbei. It was originally housed within an underwater building that was thrown up to the surface by Wadatsumi, so I think this was part of a civilization that didn't make it through the Great Flood of the Void Century, and whoever they were likely allies of the Great Kingdom. We don't know what was written on this poneglyph because Jinbei can't read them, nor could any of Big Mom's crew at the time. Pudding had not yet awakened, and so we don't know what was written on the other regular stone either, or even the coordinates of the road poneglyph. However, Brooke did manage to take rubbings of all 3 and has now delivered them to Robin, who again has an insane amount of knowledge that we as readers do not. And we went on to find another treasure trove's worth of poneglyphs on Wano, which makes sense because this island is the origin of the stones. However, they were much more split up. One was found by Trafalgar Law in the basement of Onigashima, another was discovered by Brooke in the basement of the Flower Capital Castle, and the final road poneglyph was revealed in a cavern below the basement by Kozuki Sukiyaki. So they really like their basements on Wano. But this is very good news because we have officially seen all 4 road poneglyphs, and now we can just head straight to Laugh Tale and complete the pirate kingliness. Well, nah. The issue currently is that the road poneglyph that was on Fishman Island has now mysteriously disappeared. It was there when Roger visited, but not when the Straw Hats arrived. And it's said to currently be in the possession of a man marked by flames, who sails on a pitch black pirate ship and summons gigantic whirlpools should anyone try and get close to him. So even though we've seen it at one stage, the current location of that stone is unknown, as are 15 to 16 other poneglyphs, all of which hold integral information regarding the true history of the world. 2 years ago, the Straw Hats were separated by Bartholomew Bearman on Sabadi Archipelago, and we proceeded to skip 2 years forward in time to their eventual reunion. However, the world didn't stop moving while the Straw Hats were absent, and during this time several incidences of historic proportions occurred, mostly instigated by members of the worst generation, and the most intriguing of all was the Rocky Port incident, which saw a most unlikely alliance form between Trafalgar Law, Kobe, no last name, and Marshall D. Teach in order to bring bring down one of the most legendary pirates to have ever walked the earth of this planet that is notably not called Earth. This is the story of the Rocky Port incident, which I will say is one of the most deceptively named incidences in One Piece, because despite being named the Rocky Port incident, this event actually takes place on the notorious pirate island Hachinosu, located deep in the New World. And as a brief history, this location is known as Pirate Paradise, and it holds a very pivotal pirate past, as this was the birthplace of the Rocks Pirates, the most powerful pirate crew to have ever existed, which once threatened to completely overthrow the world government, and Hachinosu is also where the Davy Back fight was developed. And as a result, it's often speculated that Rox D. Xebec was able to construct his crew via winning people from Davy Back fights, but this is without exaggeration one of the most important locations in One Piece history, as there have been at least 3 historical incidences tied directly to Hachinosu, with each of them going on to profoundly shift the direction of the world. One of which was the world government raid on the island to steal the treasure of the Rocks Pirates 38 years ago, which ended up becoming the catalyst of the God Valley incident, which we've covered in another video. And after the God Valley incident, the Rocks Pirates immediately dissolved, which left governorship of Hachinosu essentially up for grabs. And for a very long time, it was assumed that the island fell under control of Whitebeard, the next most powerful member of the Rocks Pirates. However, later on, it was revealed that it was actually Ochoku who successfully fought and won the right to rule the island. And as a quick side note, in the official translation, Ochoku is known as Wang Zi, and that's because Ochoku is the Japanese name for the real-life Chinese pirate lord Wang Zi. But I personally still call him Ochoku because Oda uses the Japanese name, not the Chinese name. But whatever his name is, Wang Choku-Zi was an absolute beast and managed to keep control of Hachinosu throughout the era of the 4 emperors despite not being an emperor himself, which is a very big and difficult deal. Because post-God Valley, in order to just survive in the New World, you generally needed to align yourself with one of the 4 emperors. But I should also say it's entirely possible that Ochoku was the only former Rocks Pirates member who actually wanted the island. Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom do not remember their time there fondly, and likely didn't even contest it. And many of the other Rocks Pirates members that we know of also had ambitions beyond ruling this one island. But even if he ended up with it by default, I need to emphasize again that Ochoku's strength is the tippy top of world class and should not be underestimated. And that strength was the main challenge that needed to be overcome during the Rocky Port incident. Because as a pirate, Ochoku specializes in breaking the law, something that potential victim Trafalgar Law was very aware of whilst planning his individual mission to infiltrate Hachinosu in order to read a poneglyph that was kept on the island. Because the law is of course Trafalgar D. Water Law, and in addition to taking revenge on a flamingo, he's trying to unravel the mystery of the Will of D. In regards to the poneglyph itself, we don't know its contents at the time of this recording. However, it's extremely unlikely that this was a road poneglyph, as 3 of them are already accounted for on Wano, Whole Cake Island, and Zo. And if Law had found the final road poneglyph on Hachinosu, then his next move after Wano surely would have been to set sail to Whole Cake Island to achieve his missing one, find Love Tale, and become the Pirate King. Hooray. But that didn't happen. There was no hooray. And Law's original plan to infiltrate Hachinosu didn't happen either. Because here's how this plan was supposed to go. Law commandeers a smuggling vessel that does business with Hachinosu, sneaks onto the island with no one noticing him, finds a mystery cube, absconds with a rubbing of said cube, then goes to the Winchester to have a nice cold pint and wait for all of this to blow over. That's how it was supposed to go, but now here's how the plan actually did go. Oh no, I, Trafalgar Law, have just ruined everything and set off a chain of events that will cause a world-changing incident. My bad, everyone. And it really was his bad, because things went wrong right from step 1. As instead of a smuggling vessel, Law accidentally hijacked a passenger ship called the Rocky Port. Why is the ship called a port, you ask? Well, don't ask questions, because I don't like answering them. The point is that this wasn't a standard passenger ship, as it actually contained the king and nobles of an unidentified country affiliated with the world government. So instead of the original plan, which was to stealthily sneak himself onto Hachinosu, from the perspective of the world government, what Trafalgar Law did was kidnap a king and brazenly set sail to the island. An alarm was immediately raised, the Marines were contacted, and Captain Kobe was dispatched to recover the king as well as his assorted nobles. Now, Kobe seems like a rather low-ranking Marine to take on a mission like this, because the brief is essentially that a ship containing a king has been abducted by a member of the worst generation. And you may think that back during this time, oh, what's the big deal? Trafalgar Law and the other supernova were still considered rookie pirates. However, this is not true, because prior to the Rocky Port incident, Law's bounty was raised to 440 million berries. So we were dealing with a very serious threat here, and Kobe, of all people, was sent to deal with him. Now, this is likely due to a combination of Kobe just happening to be in the area at the time, but also the cripplingly inelastic nature of the Marines as an organization following Sakazuki's promotion to Fleet Admiral. Because something the Fleet Admiral Sakazuki has complained about at great length after the time skip are the lack of resources and manpower available to him, which I should say is mostly due to his occupation of the New World. It's because of his aggressive nature that the Marines are always stretched so thin, all of which in this case has resulted in Kobe being put in charge of a mission that would rapidly spiral out of control and see him at the epicenter of a world-changing incident. So the stage is set, however, we have one more rotund actor to introduce, and that would be the opportunist Marshall D. Teach, aka Blackbeard, who may not be the Pirate King yet, but he certainly is the absolute king of being in the right place at the right time. If Blackbeard senses a big event happening, then he'll invite himself to the party, and he won't leave when you politely ask him to either. That's the worst part. Because Blackbeard's ambition in this conflict wasn't just to visit Hachinosu, wasn't to do stuff on the island, it was to take the island itself, which plays a big part in his master plan of something world domination. And prior to this point, Blackbeard had clearly felt that a fight against Ochoku and his forces was not one that he could win, which actually brings up the question of whether or not the Rocky Port incident took place before or after the Payback War, the latter event being the conflict between the Blackbeard pirates and the remnants of the Whitebeard pirates led by Mako the Phoenix, and what resulted in Blackbeard being labeled as an Emperor of the Sea. My inclination would be to say that the Rocky Port incident happened before the Payback War, because I do feel like at any time after Blackbeard became an emperor, his legion would have probably been powerful enough to just take the island themselves. Back to said islands though, given that Blackbeard is heavily hinted to have inherited the will of Rox de Zebek, he may see Hachinosu as his rightful territory as it was once possessed by Rox himself. Even then, Hachinosu is but a slice in Blackbeard's larger cherry pie of ambition, which we will shortly come to see as Trafalgar Law, Kobe with the Marines, and the Blackbeard pirates each converged onto Hachinosu, starting a chaotic free-for-all battle. However, it wouldn't remain that way for very long, and that is because of the aforementioned beast Ochoku. It was immediately clear to all invading parties that individually they were no match for him, as well as the thousands of pirates stationed on the island. So Hachinosu in Japanese literally means beehive, which is why you'll sometimes hear it referred to as Beehive Island, with the idea being that this island is ever so full of pirates that they just keep swarming out relentlessly and unendingly like bees from a hive. And so for the sake of survival, Law, Kobe, and Blackbeard formed one of the most unlikely alliances in One Piece history to take on the residents of the island together. And this alliance was extremely successful for each faction. And it has been implied that what happened here was sort of like a God Valley Light, with Kobe and Blackbeard teaming up to defeat Ochoku, as in chapter 1059, Blackbeard directly credits Kobe as being the reason why he was able to overcome Ochoku. However, a lot of this was also thanks to the efforts of Law, who cut through the swarm of pirates like delicious melty butter, and even collected 100 pirate hearts as a souvenir from his vacation to the island. And so this incident saw the fall of one king and the rise of 3 kings in his place. That was 2. This is 3. At this stage, we don't know if Law found the poneglyph that he was looking for. However, his role in the Rocky Port incident was enough to obtain a position as one of the 7 warlords of the sea, which Thor received after he presented the hearts of the 100 pirates he took. Trafalgar Law was also labeled as the mastermind of the Rocky Port incident, essentially due to his very Zorro-like mistake of getting on the wrong ship, being misidentified as an act of sheer genius that directly led to the collapse of Ochoku's empire. Meanwhile, Kobe became known as the hero of the Rocky Port incident, as he was able to successfully protect the people that Law accidentally kidnapped. Although we don't know exactly how Kobe eventually got everyone off Hachinosu, because the Rocky Port ship itself sustained heavy damage and remains on Hachinosu to this very day. Apparently it's being repaired and being prepared for use by its new owners. But Kobe's eventual title did lead him to being awarded a 5-star bounty from Cross Guild, meaning that he is worth 500 million berries to them. And after defeating Ochoku, Blackbeard of course installed himself as the ruler of Pirate Island, and likely used his newfound legion of previous Ochoku underlings to engage in the Payback War, all of which culminated in him becoming one of the 4 emperors of the sea. And if this is the case, then you can argue that both Kobe and Law played a direct role in making Blackbeard an emperor of the sea by assisting him during the Rocky Port incident. And should things have gone differently, should Law or Kobe have made different decisions that day, then we may not be dealing with the great overwhelming darkness of now. But the Rocky Port incident incident also had a series of knock-on events, as Koby and Blackbeard would confront each other once more on Amazon Lily, and during that time, Blackbeard decided to kidnap Koby due to his notoriety gained from Rockyport. The idea behind this was to hold Koby as ransom in exchange for Hachinosu being officially recognized as a world government nation, which would then make Blackbeard an official king. And to be completely honest here, neither Koby nor I saw how this would work, or even why Blackbeard would want to do this in the first place. He's already an Emperor of the Sea, which grants him more power and status than an individual king affiliated with the world government, but Blackbeard, he seems to have his heart set on this idea. So maybe he's planning on usurping the empty throne through a combination of legit politics and your more traditional scallywaggery. However, capturing Koby would prompt Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp and Sword to launch an attack on Hachinosu, very much creating a Rockyport sequel, but one that did not end anywhere near as kindly for the Marines, as it did result in Koby being liberated, but Garp was defeated and captured in the process. Essentially, they traded one hero for another, and therefore it could still be Blackbeard's plan to use Garp as his bargaining chip to turn Hachinosu into a world government affiliated nation. But something else we should talk about is an idea that I refer to as the Rockyport retcon, because this incident has up until recently been referred to in very vague ways by author Eiichiro Oda, who I'm convinced did not have a very clear idea of what this incident was when he first named it in the story. And we can start with that actually, the name. In world, the reason why it's called the Rockyport incident is likely to highlight the world government side of the story. It very easily could have been called, and perhaps more accurately should have been called, the Hachinosu incident. But from a meta perspective, my personal idea as to what happened here is that Oda wasn't originally planning for this incident to take place on Hachinosu, but rather it was supposed to be an actual location called Rockyport, not a ship, which is something that he may still have intended up until very recently. As in chapter 1080, Avala Pizarro mentions that they've just finished repairing Rockyport during the invasion of Sword, but the way Pizarro refers to it makes it sound like an actual port on the island rather than a ship. But the argument here is that over time the lore has evolved in Oda's mind and he has mentally retconned the incident. It is my belief that Rockyport was originally a vaguely defined location, but had to be changed to the name of a ship once Oda had a better idea of what he wanted it to be, which eventually included both Koby and Blackbeard in this event of ever-escalating proportions, because it also conflicts quite a bit with lore's motivation at the time as well. The Rockyport incident was originally portrayed to us as something that Trafalgar Law did on purpose in order to become a warlord of the sea and use that permission to take revenge on Doflamingo. However, with the way that both Law and Rockyport have evolved, Law's motivation was changed to seeking out the poneglyph on Hachinosu, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense because it was only after Dressrosa that Law resolved to figure out the mystery of the Will of D. Prior to this, Law was almost completely consumed by anger, and there was nothing on his mind except bringing down Doflamingo, which he was both willing and expecting to throw his life away to do. Trafalgar Law himself has changed a lot during the course of One Piece, as Oda had originally intended him to be more of an antagonistic character, if not an outright antagonist, which is something that was still the general idea all the way up to Punk Hazard before the more protagonistic shift was made. Meaning that when the Rockyport incident was originally conceptualized, it was likely that Law was still this fiendish mastermind to some degree, doing horrible things for the sake of achieving another horrible thing it is he wanted to do. But as Law evolved and became a much more clear-cut good guy, the original reasoning for the Rockyport incident wouldn't quite hold anymore. And so he needed a slightly more noble reason to cause this incident. So what Oda did is he gave pre-Dressrosa Law his post-Dressrosa motivation, which I guess it's fine if you don't think too much about it, but all of the above may also be reasons why Oda isn't so keen on drawing the Rockyport incident in the manga, because it does involve a lot of elements that don't necessarily fit cleanly together. And so the whole legend of this event may be better served by keeping it as vague as possible, to keep the overall picture a bit out of focus so that the imperfections aren't quite as visible, or if you do need to explain them, then look, let's just say that these inconsistencies are a result of details being lost and changed in retellings of stories over time.